That clock is slow. Good evening. Good evening. Let me call to order the St. Helena City Council meeting for September 13, 2016. Ms. Kroll, would you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ms. Black, roll call.
Councilmember Kroll,
Here.
Doreen,
Here.
Pitts,
Here.
Vice Mayor White,
Here.
Mayor Galbraith.
Here. Public forum. Public forum is an opportunity for members of the public to address us on matters of municipal concern that are not on our agenda this evening. Does anybody wish to speak at public forum? Seeing none, we'll move on to reports by staff and city council, starting with the city manager.
I have nothing this evening, thank you.
Ms. Mitz?
Thank you very much. I am very happy to let everyone know that thank you to the City Council for approving travel for me to go to GFOA's budget seminar. So I will be missing the next City Council meeting as I'll be in Chicago for a very intense 4-day training. So thank you very much, and I will miss being here at the next council meeting.
Okay, very good. Ms. Black? Mr. Brown? Mr. Hausch?
Thank you, Mayor. I actually have a few things I'd like to update the council and the community on. The first being the general plan and general plan EIR timeframe. We had originally targeted September to bring the general plan and EIR before the Planning Commission for their review. Unfortunately, some staffing changes in the department and the volume of EIR comments has resulted in us not being able to meet that originally targeted timeframe. We don't have an updated schedule yet. It'll be sometime in the winter, but we'll bring that back to the council and the community when we know more details. However, I'd also like to let the council and community know that the Hunter EIR is expected to be posted for review and comment in October. I don't have a set date yet, but it will be sometime in October based on the current time frame that we're looking at. We're reviewing the administrative draft currently. And then also, as everyone in the community knows, I'm sure the council, the response period for the RFP ended, and staff will be bringing back a presentation of those responses to the city council at the next meeting. This is intended purely as a conceptual presentation to allow the council see the number of responses that we got and what the projects propose on a conceptual level. It'll identify the respondent teams, basically who's behind each of the responses, and then also introduce the RFP review team that the city put together, at least in name if they're not all present at the meeting. But that will be on the 27th, so it's important for the public to know that that will be happening.
Okay, terrific. Ms. Crichton? Okay. It was probably not politically correct for me to say I was brought up in an environment where ladies were first, but that's okay, Chief.
I offered to let her go, but she didn't want to cut. Thank you. I just want to let everybody know that last week our newest officer, Melissa Brown, started, jumped in with 2 feet, and she's going through the field training program now. Officer Jovi Ohm graduated from the academy on Saturday. I was able to attend his graduation. He was one of 2 cadets that graduated in uniform, meaning that had been picked up by an agency. And so I was able to go on the stage and pin his badge on him for his graduation and met 30 of his family members. And
Wow. Okay.
So he will start on Thursday morning at 6 a.m. And then finally, Sergeant Chris Hartley was promoted to Lieutenant Chris Hartley, effective last Friday, but we had his badge pinning ceremony this morning. Lieutenant Hartley will come up a little bit later when I have a presentation, but we'll bring all 3 of them in front of the council probably sometime in November, hopefully, to have a formal swearing in with their family and friends. But I just want to let everybody know that they'd started, and now we're finally getting back up to staff.
Okay, terrific.
Thank you.
Terrific. All right, Ms. Crichton?
I just wanted to let everyone to know about 2 events that we have coming up this Thursday to celebrate Latino Heritage Month. We have El Comalito, and they're going to do traditional Mexican paper flowers. A lot of people are looking forward to that. And then also the week after, that's at 6:30. And then the Thursday following, September 22nd, we'll have Spider-Man at the library. So there's a lot of kids excited about that one, and that will be, both of these are supported by Friends and Foundation. I also wanted to let everyone know that we had 499 children sign up for the summer reading program this year. Leslie just couldn't get that last kid. We were debating going onto the street to get someone to sign up, but we decided to stay with 499. And today I literally started the state statistical report for the library. And one of those things that I did today was find out how many hours we had volunteers last year. We had 1,226 hours.
Okay, good, terrific.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Pitts?
Nothing.
Ms. Kroll?
Nothing, thank you.
Mr. Dorian?
Couple of items of interest. As you know, I'm the liaison to the Multicultural Committee, which met last week. Committee is working diligently on the September 16th Independence Day celebration, which is going to occur this week, this Friday, at starting at 5 o'clock to 8:30. There will be music, singing, ballet folklorico, dancing, food and beverage vendors, and a flag exchange. It's a really vibrant, wonderful event, a lot of children, and I encourage people to go to that. At the Multicultural Committee itself, we initiated discussions about the relevancy of the Multicultural Committee pursuant to our discussions a couple weeks ago in terms of our committees, and we're just starting that conversation right now to focus on goals, or the committee is. I'm not. I mean, I'm there as a liaison, but trying to encourage this committee to focus on what it's going to do in the next couple of years. And so hopefully we'll make some strides, and I'll be able to report back later. Another thing I wanted to report is that on September 18th at 11 a.m. at the Catholic Church, there will be a Blue Mass honoring first responders, police, firefighters, sheriff's department, paramedics, emergency medical technicians, and other officials in the city and Napa County who respond to emergency situations or are involved in law enforcement or protective services. The Mass, well, I'm a Catholic, so I'm used to going there, but it's an ecumenical service. Encourage family and members of those services to attend. It's a very special Mass for those folks who wear blue. So that's it.
Okay, very good. Mr. White?
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody again that the WIC will be hosting a workshop on September 22nd, and it'll be at the NVTA's boardroom down on Burnell Street in Napa, and that's Thursday, September 22nd. It'll start at 3 o'clock and probably go until 6. So, and that'll cover the Napa Valley groundwater sustainability analysis.
All right. And I have just one announcement. I want to compliment the Recreation Department on a very successful bocce season. We did have the playoffs last week. My team survived into Saturday, and then I couldn't believe it. I started at 8:30 and didn't quit till 4 because we made it into the finals. And for the first time in my life, I received a sports medal, a silver medal. It took 75 years to get there, but no Olympian could feel prouder than I, and especially for the city and the way it ran this bocce league, and also the condition of the courts, which received wonderful comment many, many times during the season. So thank you to the Recreation Department. Okay. That takes us to the consent items. We have a number of items on consent. I'm going to go through them, and if any member of the council or public wishes to pull a consent item, then we'll go through the normal hearing process. Item 6, consideration of proposed approval of regular meeting minutes of August 23, 2016. 7, consideration and proposed approval of a resolution setting a hearing to approve the annexation of territory into the St. Helena Municipal Sewer District Number 1, MSD Annexation Number 129, 1357 El Bonita Avenue, St. Helena, CA, APN 009-431-003. 8, consideration of proposed approval of a resolution approving an MOU between the St. Helena School District and the St. Helena Recreation Department to provide services for an after-school enrichment program for the St. Helena Primary and St. Helena Elementary Schools for the period August 1st, 2016 through June 30, 2017. 9, consideration and proposal of a resolution approving temporary closure of Oak Avenue and Anna Street and authorizing possession of open alcoholic beverages on those public streets for the October 15, 2016 Hometown Harvest Festival. 10, consideration and proposed approval of resolution approving out-of-state travel for City Manager Jennifer Phillips to attend a Harvard Kennedy School program in Cambridge, Massachusetts, September 18th through 23, 2016, for a total not to exceed amount of $9,000. 11, consideration and proposed approval of a resolution approving a budget adjustment transferring the remaining $444.52 in Fund 380-4600-2244 for Elsie the Library Cat from fiscal year 2015-16 to fiscal year 2016-17. 12, consideration and proposed approval of a resolution rescinding resolution number 2015-147 adopting investment policy for the City of St. Helena and review annual investment report. 13, consideration and proposed approval of a resolution authorizing the St. Helena High School annual homecoming parade on Main Street and authorizing city staff to assist with traffic control before, during, and after the parade. 14, consideration and proposed approval of a resolution authorizing amendment to unrepresented compensation resolution to include a new compensation schedule for the Assistant Public Works Director position and for the position to receive 40 additional hours of executive leave for the same conditions as at-will executive positions. 15, consideration and proposed approval of the First Amendment to the Professional Service Agreement with Hansford Economic Consulting to provide additional work outside the original water and wastewater rate study scope, increasing the contract amount by $13,020 for a total contract of $61,370 and authorizing a budget increase of $13,000 split equally between accounts 561-4300-2130 and 571-4300-2130. Funds for 561 will be taken from the Water Enterprise unrestricted net position, and funds for 571 will be transferred from the wastewater capital project to the wastewater operating fund identified above. So it's items 6 through 15. Does anybody wish to pull any of those items? Seeing none, the chair will entertain a motion to approve on consent items 6 through 15.
So moved.
Second.
Ms. Black?
Vice Mayor White,
Yes.
Councilmember Kroll,
Yes.
Pitts,
Yes.
Doring,
Yes.
Mayor Galbraith.
Yes. That takes us to item 16, annual residential growth management update. I like that word annual. And Mr. House-Sherrod.
Thank you, sir. Members of the council. I'll just wait for the PowerPoint to load up here, but as you mentioned, tonight's presentation is an annual update to the growth management program or system. The code identifies that September, the first meeting of every September, the council receives an update on the growth management system. The last update was actually provided in March of this year because there had been a gap from the previous one. So the previous one was actually in 2012. In today's presentation, I'll be providing a current status of kind of where we are with the allotments, and then also asking for some input on potential changes as we move forward to consider some revisions to the ordinance. As you're all well aware, St. Helena has a growth management system that limits residential growth through the building permit issuance process. Essentially, there's a maximum of 9 building permits that are available for new market rate units within the city per year. And any permits that are not issued from that 9 are banked into basically a reservoir that are available only for projects that provide a minimum of 40% of their overall unit count as affordable housing. There are some exemptions to this. Obviously, affordable housing units aren't included in the counts. Second units aren't required to be issued growth management allotments, and a demolition and reconstruction of an existing home or a relocation of an existing home is not subject. There's also some other allowances given to units of 850 square feet or less, whereby those are counted as a half a unit for purposes of an allotment. And essentially, it's somewhat of an incentive to construct smaller units. In 2016, St. Helena has approved, as of today, 3 new residential units and has currently under review 9 additional residential units which require allotments. So, for example, the Our Town St. Helena project on McCorkle is exempt from these requirements as it's an affordable housing project. As identified in the last update in March, the current growth management ordinance is somewhat problematic. First of all, these allotments are supposed to be issued on January 1st, which is a city holiday, so there's no staff available. The building permit is the trigger for the allotments, and so this creates somewhat of an interesting situation where a more complex project that was received approval prior to a more simple project may be leapfrogged by the simple project because they would be able to submit their building permits sooner than the more complex project, and therefore getting approval to construct prior to a project that was actually approved before that one. Because of that, it kind of sets up a competition amongst projects, whereby if staff was looking at two very similar projects that were requesting allotments on the last day, there's no criteria for staff to decide which is more deserving of those allotments. However, as identified in March, staff currently has interpreted the code to use the first approved language that's in the current ordinance to mean discretionary approval. And so based on that, we are assigning allotments upon discretionary approval. So when you receive approval from the Planning Commission for your project, if you're required to obtain an allotment for that, then we essentially identify what year that allotment's expected to come from, and in order to try to deal with some of the issues that were identified. So this is the chart that was in the staff report that shows the history of the residential growth management allotments since 2012. It's similar to the chart that was provided in March. However, it's just been updated to identify that we have assigned 3 allotments currently, and then obviously we potentially could have more as the year goes on. So go to the next slide. And so there is a draft ordinance as attachment to this presentation, and it incorporates the changes staff's presented, basically tying the issuance of allotments to the approval of discretionary actions. However, staff, in considering making some changes to the ordinance, there's some other elements that should be considered by the council. Number one is the timing. So essentially, currently the planning department resources are very limited. We're working on a number of projects, including the general plan and general plan update, EIR. And within the general plan, there are several policies that direct changes, or at least the consideration of changes to the growth management system. And then also, it's worth noting that revisions to the growth management system provides a significant opportunity for the city to obtain additional community benefits from approving residential development. And so this is somewhat of a unique update in that staff is requesting council consideration or direction on potential changes to the ordinance, and most likely would be brought back at the next annual presentation, so September of 2017. By that time, we would have incorporated any changes that are directed today from the from the City Council, taken those changes before the Planning Commission for their review and consideration, and then bring back a full amended ordinance for council review and action at a later date. And so we'll get into some of those questions now. So in the staff report, there were 3 questions that were asked. One, should the city look to incentivize certain development types through the use of growth management allotments? And so if the council sees certain types of development, multifamily housing, so apartments or condos or townhomes, mixed use units, so units that are tied to commercial development, or workforce housing units, as something that would be desirable for the community, and not only desirable but also worth incentivizing, then staff could explore using methods to incentivize those types of units in granting allotments for their new construction. Other ways to incentivize certain types of development would be to exempt specific unit types. So if you, similar to how affordable housing units are exempted, if you exempted workforce housing, for example, staff could explore the methodologies for doing that and the legal implications, and then obviously bring back that for a full presentation before the commission and council. Similarly, utilizing banked allotments from the current bank that the city has would be another methodology for incentivizing certain types of units, should the council direct staff to explore that. And so that's one of the questions staff is requesting direction on, is should the use of allotments be seen as, or should incentives for certain types of units or housing developments be explored through the allotment process. Second question staff is looking for is, should the ordinance limit the overall number of allotments that could be issued to one project? So for example, if we approved an 8-unit project, or a 9-unit project, I'm sorry, that utilized all allotments from 2016, then someone would be precluded from coming in just to build a single-family home. So it could have an impact on the ability for one house to be built if a project that utilized all allotments essentially used them all. So that's just a question. Should we explore limiting granting all allotments to one project or not? Or maybe require council or commission approval, another step in the approval in order for one project to be granted all of them? And then finally, should the issuance of allotments be prioritized based on specific criteria other than the date of approval? And so this is kind of getting back to the fact that having a growth management ordinance provides opportunities for the council and the commission to incentivize certain types of development or prioritize certain types of development. And so one option would be the project that provides a greater community benefit than another may be seen as receiving or basically deserving of an allotment over another one. So a project that provided affordable housing, a project that provided workforce housing, those types of options are something that could be explored by staff. Obviously there's legal ramifications and there are other implications that would be associated with that. We'd be happy to explore them. But there are options for the council to consider in updating the ordinance. And so with that concludes my presentation. And actually there is the discussion of the fiscal impact. Essentially we haven't had time to do any fiscal analysis. However, development impact fees are based on square footage, and so obviously there would be some implications should less or more units be built or larger or smaller units be built, but that would be explored further through any recommendations on the ordinance itself. And then the recommended action is for City Council to receive the proposed update and provide direction on the potential revisions to the ordinance. That concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions.
Are there any initial questions of staff before I open the public comment?
Just one. Do we have a definition of what workforce housing units is?
Currently, no.
Okay.
All right. All right, let me open the public comment.
What do you think it
excuse me.
means? How are you using the term?
So I meant, so if, for example, a project came in, a hotel project would be a good example. You know, there's obviously a lot of concern in the community over the cost of housing and the availability of housing. And so a project that was able to, maybe if they received approval for a hotel, but they, as a condition of that, they were supposed to build 10 new units, the growth management system actually would limit their ability to build those units in 1 year because there's only 9 allotments available. So those are the types of things to consider. It's interesting as you start to think about this, it kind of permeates a lot of, or it has the ability to permeate a lot of elements of development within the community. So the definition of workforce housing would be housing tied to a specific business in the community.
Thank you.
It also might be a reason that more workforce housing hasn't been built.
Correct?
I don't know.
I don't know, just as long as we all are on the same page of what it means,
Well,
we can have a discussion.
We've needed it. We've been talking about having a definition of that for 10 years.
Okay. Let me open the public hearing and then we'll see where we go after that.
Good evening, council members. My name is Joe McGrath. I'm a proud native of St. Helena and property owner at properties at Grayson and McCorkle Ave. I think you have this letter in front of me, but I'll go ahead and read it anyway in case you have any questions. As you may or may not know, I currently have a design review application pending to build an 8-unit apartment complex on McCorkle Avenue. And I'd just like to make a few points with regard to this topic, the growth ordinance, and some of my suggestions, I guess, on how this ordinance could be improved to enable a process that results in an improved mix of, and I'll use a broader term, affordable housing to be constructed in St. Helena. And I'll just note, I believe, based on all my understanding of the history here, is that the type of project that we're proposing is actually sort of considered to be kind of like the ideal type of infill project in St. Helena. It's small. It's on a already developed lot. It's close to city center, close to transportation. et cetera, and is not sort of a large-scale multifamily development. So the first item that causes some challenges, and Noah mentioned, is timing of allocation. The current ordinance is not specifically clear on when in the design review and building permit process that the allocation units is reserved. And to the point that Noah just made, my understanding is also that the current practice is to reserve the allocation at design review approval, which is a better interpretation than certainly, in my opinion, than it would be at either building permit submission or issuance. And the ordinance says allocation of regulated building permits shall be issued on January 1st, as Noah said, which would indicate that the allocation not made until either the application or the issuance of the building permit. And this causes some pretty significant challenges for more complex projects. And I would strongly review that either we sort of codify, strongly advocate that we either codify, to Noah's suggestion, that it's done at design review approval, or even in the case of maybe larger, more complex projects when fees are paid for design review application. And then maybe such an allocation could be reserved for a fixed period for an active application, for a fixed period for an application that remains active. I submitted my original application for our project in do I have 30 seconds left? Mid-February this year, so it's taken 8 months, and it would be very foreseeable that we could easily get sort of leapfrogged or lapped by single-family developments that take a lot less time in terms of the engineering review, the public works review, et cetera. I mean, the staffing levels at Public Works alone has probably cost me 2 months delays in this project application review. Can I just have a few more seconds?
Sure, sure. We'll extend your time by 2 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. The second item that is somewhat, challenging, and this is actually something that I probably didn't learn until too late in the process, is the half-unit allocation for 850 square feet or less. I believe the current ordinance for single-family homes is 4,300 square feet is allowed without sort of additional exceptions being granted. And yet, if you try to build sort of attached multifamily, half-unit allocation is 850. It's really difficult to build a two-bedroom, two-bath at below 850. It's really a two-bedroom, one-bath, and it definitely precludes a three-bedroom. And so I would advocate that the council consider looking at maybe a sliding scale from studios, one-bedrooms, up through three-bedrooms that might say, I don't know, quarter unit, half unit, three-quarters a unit, or something like that, that allows for sort of a broader mix of attached multifamily. And then the third item is that, as Noah indicated, you can use the bank of allocated units if you have 40% affordable. The challenge is that the definition from my interpretation of the current ordinance is affordable for sale units includes very low and low income. It does not include moderate. Affordable for rent units excludes moderate income housing. So if you're in sort of a develop and hold type of strategy, basically affordable does not encompass sort of middle income type of clients. And if you look at the median home price in St. Louis is $1 million at 3.5% at $900,000 down. That's $48,000 per year at 30% of your income. That means you're making $160,000 a year to afford $1 million home. And if you bridge that all the way to if you bridge that to the cutoff at the low income, you're talking about basically a $42,000 per year income. So you've got a span between $42,000 a year and $160,000 a year where there's really nothing that would be sort of oriented in the current ordinance to develop or build to that type of economic strata. So I would encourage you to strongly consider something that sort of incorporates a for-lease type of model, which reflects the trends that are happening across the United States in terms of home ownership, in terms of millennial and Gen X cultural patterns, which tend to go towards leasing instead of buying. But the current ordinance really would not incent a developer to build anything from literally from low all the way to high. So everything from sort of low to moderate, which is 120% of median income. And in St. Helena in particular, and I made a point in a letter, your median income is artificially deflated relative to most areas based on the nature of second homes and a retirement community relative to it's very out of proportion relative to the dollars per square foot costs of housing here. And I listed an example there. So
Thank you very much.
those are my 3 recommendations. Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.
Thanks.
Mr. McGrath.
Thank you.
Any other public comment?
My name is Bobby Monette, and I'm speaking as a citizen, actually the citizen who lives next door to the project that was just talked about. I'm a bit overwhelmed with all of this, but I do have a couple of things to say. I think that it's very complicated, and I think that given the housing issues in this town, I think a lot of these rules are made so that affordable housing will be built. And I think that the idea of not having middle income or, the upper part of affordable in the apartments is probably in order to make sure that apartments will be able to accommodate the need for low affordable housing, which is really hard to get. So I think that before you look into changing anything about that we vet that with the public, with a lot of public input. There are no affordable apartments being, designated in this particular development. And I want to also point out that square footage is one thing, 850 square feet for two bedrooms. The bedrooms, in terms of infrastructure and parking, the bedrooms drive the density, and the density drives the number of cars. And there's no way to control head of households, so that when you have apartments, you could have, with 2 bedrooms, 5 people legally living there, and they could all be head of household. And that happens a lot in this town, because it could be that 5 adults are living in a home, in a 2-bedroom apartment, and there are 5 cars. So, you have to plan for that maximum. So I think before making any changes in any of this, that we really need to have a dialogue with the public. Even a workshop on this particular issue. I hope that you don't make any recommendations tonight, because personally I haven't had the time to digest this, and I'm probably more aware of it than a lot of people who have intense interests in this issue. I think you all know what a big issue this is for the town and how complicated these questions are. So I'm hoping that you won't make any decisions tonight and will allow us to vet this in a very open way that's generous with time, so that people in the public will feel they've had time to weigh in. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further public comment? Okay, I'll close the public comment and invite council discussion. Who would like to lead off? Mr. Doring?
No.
I'd just like to remind the council, we are not asking for any decisions tonight. It's purely direction on future changes that then would obviously go before the planning commission, city council, and to the public as needed, as far as a workshop or something like that.
All right.
I'll start if you'd like.
Sure, go ahead.
So I also haven't had a lot of time to digest this letter, because I just got it when I got here. But and I do think the opportunity for more input is a good idea. I also think that on somewhat first glance, Mr. McGrath's ideas do make sense. Especially, starting with the first point, which is the timing of the allocation. It's ambiguous in our ordinance now, and I do think that it doesn't make sense. It does make sense to put something in, because if it didn't include, if it didn't start when the design review fees were paid, what if you were granted design review and then went to go get a building permit and they're not available? It just, people need to make plans. So that makes sense to me. The square footage makes sense to me as well. And like I said, it's just on first glance. And then it's a much broader discussion, what is workforce housing? Because the reality is, there are people in that gap of income between 42 and 160 who cannot find housing here. So it's a problem. I don't have all the solutions for it, but it is a problem that exists, and I know it exists because I have employees in that income who, so I think I think you're right, Bobby, it does call for a bigger discussion. I worry that maybe the reason we don't have any more apartment projects like this is because the way our ordinance has been worded has precluded any developer from being interested in building them. And I do think it's important to have a mix of housing. So I definitely think we should discuss this further. I'm not not at a point to recommend anything one way or another, just because I need to digest it a little bit more. But I do think that these are great points. And I think it might be a really good discussion to decide what is workforce housing. We've been throwing that word around for as long as I've been on the council, and it seems like workforce housing might be something with income in that gap.
Okay, I'll go next. I agree with all of that. I think we should answer these questions, maybe not tonight, but seriously think about them. I think there should be some kind of incentivizing to bridge that gap between the affordable housing projects and the market rate. Thank you. I mean, we've got so many people that can only afford to rent an apartment in Napa, and then they drive up here every day to go to work, and I think we've got an opportunity, like with Joe's project, to be able to fill some of that gap, and I think there might be a couple of other projects coming online or in the future that we should take a look at, and maybe it does make sense to exempt those kinds of multifamily projects that allow to get some of our workforce off of the road and living here in town. So I'd like to seriously look at that. I'd love to see a definition of workforce. I thought maybe Noah had some magic definition that.
Or I also think maybe the policy.
Wait to see whether Mr. White said.
So anyway, I would like to look at that. I think it's obvious to me that the reason we haven't had any apartment complexes built in the last 30 years, 40 years, is because we've precluded. We've really concentrated only on government-built affordable housing that has precluded, a regular developer that's not depending upon federal funding or state funding to be able to build apartments or townhouses or condominiums that would fill that gap. So anyway, I think we need to seriously look at that and see how we can incentivize. I know most of the people that I know that have come into town and rent like an 800 square foot houses in the $3,000 to $4,000 range, which is, pretty unaffordable for anybody making less than, say, $160,000 a year. So I think there's a big gap that we need to fill, and we need to help fill that market. So,
can I make one point?
Sure.
As a follow-up to Peter's, I also think that maybe the policy. So I don't know what the policy decision was behind having a different standard for sale and for rent in terms of the range of incomes included. But I think that maybe we need to take a look at whether that policy reason is still in effect, given the demographics of our town and given the economic realities of our town and and what Mr. McGrath called the cultural patterns of millennials not necessarily being interested in homeownership. But I agree with you, Peter, that there's very, very little for rent, not just for people in the low and very low category, but also in the moderate.
Right. Yeah, and one thing that I see, the trend that what our ordinances have done to St. Helena is really, it's incentivized second homes. That seems to be what we've created here is a market for second homes and for nothing else. So, fix it.
Yeah, look, I was about to jump in and say I think this problem is becoming worse with every day that passes. I think that the proliferation of second homes in our community, and it's great because it's almost this unintended consequence of retaining this character and charm where all of a sudden everyone wants a second home here because there is this community. But at the same time, it's starting to gut our community because every day a new home is bought that was maybe affordable for someone who was renting or affordable to buy. It's getting torn down and turned into a $2.5 million home or more. And that trend isn't gonna stop or slow, in my opinion. And so I think we need to be proactive. I think we need to start, though. I think we really need a fresh look. A lot of this stuff, I look at the 40% and I'm like, well, why is 40% the magic number to dip into the banked, right? If we have an issue where we have multiple developers that want to build a project and there's only 9 available and they each want to do 8-unit projects, does it really need to be 40% to make it work? Or if I want to do a small 3-unit infill project, 40% means that I got to do 2 as affordable and 1 as market, and that's just not going to pencil. But if I could do 2 as market and 1 as affordable, then you have a project, right? So I think we need to give it all a fresh look, but it needs to start with what are our needs, right? And I do think that our needs are not just low and very low anymore. I'm starting to hear anecdotally from families that I know that are working professionals earning in the middle hundreds of, 150, 160,000, if not more. They can't find anywhere to buy and can't find anywhere to rent either. And so I think we need a fresh look at what are our needs, right? What's the makeup of the community? Where is it trended compared to sort of 10 years ago? And then once we understand that information, then we start to formulate a housing policy that makes sense. And frankly, I think part of finding new revenue sources, whether it's property transfer tax that maybe we discussed down the road, need to be considered as well in terms of solving the problem. And how are we going to generate this housing? I think there has been general consensus that the infill development is a smart way to go, but let's look at that and make sure that the right tools are in place to allow developers to actually take on such projects. So I'm not prepared to make I don't want to do this piecemeal. I think this is a larger discussion and larger, problem that we have to tackle. It's not going to happen quickly. I think it's going to take some real, thoughtful approach and research. And then I think we need to look to other communities that have, had these same issues, same pressures, and same problems, and glean what insights we can from them as we move forward.
And farther down the pike, we have in another item the discussion about the firefighters. If we want to continue to have a volunteer firefighter, we need to find places for them to live. Many of them would not qualify for low or very low income housing, but would in the moderate, and not including moderate in the for rent category may exclude them from being able to rent. So I'm just saying this is a bigger, this has bigger ramifications.
Yeah, if we lose housing for firefighters, we potentially lose the volunteer fire department, which then has a real negative financial consequence
on the city.
And the same thing is true for coaching for sports, right? It's harder and harder to recruit when families that want to participate and volunteer that time can't afford to live here and be here after work and continue to participate in those activities.
Mr. Doring?
Well, I agree with what you're saying, Greg and Sharon and Peter. I wrote a letter to the editor probably a year ago on this issue, and I believe it's worse than it was then in terms of the loss of our middle-class housing and workforce housing, whatever way you want to call it. Employees have to come here. They commute into town. They're not here. I'm focusing in on the number one question: should there be incentives? Yes, there should be incentives. I could think of all kinds of different incentives. We have hotel projects that are probably going to come before us, and one of the complaints one of the issues is there enough land for them to build workforce housing on the land that they want to build a hotel on? That's an issue. So, you know, there could be other incentives. They can buy land and dedicate it to the city. They could buy an old building and refurbish it, and maybe it was a commercial building at one point, and they can turn it into workforce housing. Those are, you know, we have to be really creative in terms of encouraging appropriate hotels, depending on where they are and all the infrastructure issues with water and sewer and all of that, but also incentivizing them to produce housing for us that maybe not on site. I think we don't have the luxury of a lot of land here in St. Helena, so I'm very open to that, land dedications or refurbishing of other buildings that they can do. I think we also have to focus on assisted living, something that doesn't come up very often. Mm-hmm. We are aging in St. Helena, to put it bluntly, and we're really not focusing in on that issue. We have a high senior population, and we really need to focus on finding places and maybe even adding on to existing places where we can have assisted living. It's something nobody wants to grapple with, but I see that. I'm 55, so not getting any younger. So I think that's one thing I would like to see more collaboration or trying to get developers and healthcare providers together somehow and maybe work on that project. You know, the issues that Mr. McGrath raised, I think they're all legitimate issues. They need to be explored. I haven't had a chance to absorb them. And then the issue of a simpler project, leapfrogging, a more complex yeah, we have to deal with that. That obviously is not fair to anyone. That needs to be addressed. The question of whether one project should have all of the allocations, I'm not so much concerned about that, but we probably, just from experience, and we can look back at the last 10 years and go, well, how many, you know, one-time single-family residents are built, you know, or want to be built, you know, they seek a permit to be built? Is it 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5? And we can just say, look, you do it, but we want to set aside a couple every year for those occasional, I want to build my own home. I think we can solve it that way by just having a couple of left over and not, you know, but I wouldn't want to damper a project that could be a really good project and could be economically feasible and really a good complement to our community because, you know, because of that one issue. The community benefit issue, yeah, I think we need to focus on that. However you define workforce housing, we need it. I agree with you. All levels of income, it's needed. I'm married to a teacher. I know a lot of people in that sort of middle class. Well, some people say I'm not middle class, but anyway, folks, teachers, firefighters, police, those kinds of folks can't afford to live here. It's just unbelievably expensive here. So we need to focus on that. These are our employees. They're serving our children. They're serving our community, and so we need to, sort of as a moral issue, we have to be able to provide some housing for them. So whatever way we can incentivize developers to do that, I'm open to exploring that.
Well, let me make just a couple of comments here. I think the sentence that caught my eye the most in the staff report was the existing draft direction to consider revisions to the GMS combined with the other ongoing planning work in the city appears to support undertaking a comprehensive review of the ordinance after the general plan is adopted. To me, that is the appropriate sequence. That's not to say that the timing issue shouldn't be addressed sooner. That's a timing issue. But the other issues here are interrelated. They're extremely complex, and it's going to take a lot of thought and community involvement, and I think a real study by the Planning Commission and recommendations from them to us in order to highlight and narrow the issues. I'm also concerned about, as my colleagues are, about workforce housing in this sense, and that is that apartments, condominiums, townhomes all sound good, but how is it that they will result not in luxury apartments, condominiums, and townhomes as opposed to ones that are really amenable to the group that we all think we need to target? I just don't understand at this point what the regulatory framework is that we can or should impose to ensure that that happens. That's a real concern of mine. It's not that I'm against apartments, condominiums, or townhomes, but if we allow them or incentivize them, they really have to result in housing for workforce as has been defined in terms of this gap that we have. So those are my initial thoughts with respect to it. And I can't say that we provide a lot of guidance. Maybe others have some further thoughts here.
Well, do you think that moderate income is that gap between 42 and 160 that Mr. McGrath, and I don't know if those numbers are right, but it seems like that's sort of what we're a little bit talking about in terms of what moderate is. And if you, one of the ways that you would regulate it is you would require moderate, a certain number of, you would cap the luxury numbers and allow moderate. I mean, I think that's kind of one of the central things, is that one of the central issues as I'm reading this letter more and more is that it seems like there should be consistency in our for sale policies and our for rent policies. The for sale includes moderate. The for rent precludes moderate.
I don't disagree with that at all. I just want to be sure that these units, if they are allowed, really result in units that are rented to folks that are moderate. That means they're regulated. They're
Will
not
it be percentagized?
They're regulated. They're not free market units. They would become regulated units. Otherwise, they may disappear out of the workforce housing market. That's the problem I have.
I don't see why we couldn't define that area of level of rental, and so there's a basic range that can be charged for charged for those apartments, and maybe that's the incentive, that if you want to build a 15-unit apartment complex, that it could be built in 1 year, and the incentive is that it can be built, but it has to be in that range. It can't be a luxury condo or apartment that you're going to rent out to, vacation rentals and that kind of thing.
But that also means I would think that you would have to involve the Napa Housing Authority or whoever to supervise it and make sure people qualify within the income ranges.
I don't see where that would be a problem.
May not be. I don't know.
Do you need clear direction on the timing issue?
That would be beneficial, I think, to staff, just given kind of prioritization of workloads. And I do feel waiting till after the general plan obviously would be a key element to being able to undertake the level of detail that the council is seeking in kind of considering some of these options. In addition to the fact that the general plan itself does provide direction on the growth management ordinance.
Okay. It would be my recommendation that allocations would be made at design review.
Which is how it's currently being implemented. So the council
is
supporting the staff interpretation of implementing the code, and staff has worked with the legal team to make sure that they're comfortable with the allowances for interpreting the code in a way that does grant allocations at discretionary approval.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, what are the alternatives to that?
Yeah.
Right? Are there?
Permits?
To so I've done a little research. So the growth management ordinance has been around longer than the requirement for design review for a single family home. And so that's most likely the reason why it was tied to building permits, because there was no discretionary trigger for someone to build a single family home. And so therefore, in order to actually manage growth, you had to tie it to the building permit. When the requirement for design review for the single family home was then implemented, the growth management ordinance procedures weren't thought about in how that could trip up the review of a single family home project as opposed to a multifamily home project, et cetera. Alternative ways of allocating growth management, I've seen it done. I've never seen it done at submittal, as Mr. McGrath recommended. I've seen it done at approval of a discretionary, or between discretionary approval and building permit submittal, or then the building permit itself. So once you receive your approval for a discretionary project, you then send a letter requesting to hold or lock in your allotments, and you indicate when you intend to build. And that gets to some of the issues of you might be receive discretionary approval in 2016, but you know there's no way you're going to break ground until 2017, so you request your allotments for that year, and that kind of holds it. So it's somewhat of an in-between. You have the right to request it once your discretionary approval has occurred, but you don't have to wait till you actually submit for your building permits, because then you could run into some of the leapfrog issues. So those are the three ways I've seen it done.
But that could go the opposite way. Let's say that someone got their discretionary approval for a 9-unit complex, right? And they said, I want them, but then they don't actually build it for 2 years, and everyone's sort of waiting, right? So it's almost like it's not the reverse leapfrog, but it's the opposite problem, right?
And that does happen occasionally.
Right.
So maybe we put a time limit on it. If
Or look, it might be that if it hasn't happened by a certain time in that particular year,
lose your
then they
position.
bump to the next year, right?
Right.
No, I'm curious, have you thought about the second home issue here? And from your experience, are there things that we could be doing in terms of design review or other things? Obviously, we can't stop someone from buying a second home. There are homes that are sort of maybe needing rehab, and I'm thinking maybe during that process, I don't know, this seems kind of weird, but not make it so attractive, make it harder, smaller, maybe the second home issue, all those things. People come here and they want to have their beautiful big home. I'm not sure, is there room there in the design review aspects of the city planning that we can, I don't know, it's not incentivize, but decentivize, I guess,
One thing they
second
do.
homes. Or I'm worried about folks who are just, maybe a family is living in a nice 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, paying a decent rent. Maybe the home is older, 60s or 70s home, but the landlord decides, you know what, I'm gonna sell this because Joe and Mary want to come in and totally rehabilitate it and make it twice as nice, basically. And I don't know. I'm just curious about your thoughts in that area.
I think a lot of that is market based, and
Yeah.
it's not something that the government is easily injects limitations into those things. From my experience, a lot of the really large homes, I think, that are proposed, as we've all seen, a lot of folks come in and they build up to the maximum allowable FAR. A lot of that, frankly, is done by developers who, price per square foot. I mean, that's where the market kicks in. So it may not be the individual who says, I want a second home in St. Helena. It may be the individual who says, I'm going to build someone a second home in St. Helena and get the maximum amount of return on it. So getting back to that issue, one of the ways to do that may be the square footage limitation, because if you are allowed to build more smaller units, that brings the price down just by the square footage, cost per square foot element. And then also it's not the big second home idea that some people may be looking for, maybe something that's more workforce or those types of elements. But again, I haven't done a lot of analysis on this. We know that the ordinance is broken. We have an interpretation that's allowing it to work. However, the general plan directs us to fix it, and we know we're going to spend some work on it. So as we begin to spend that work, let's let the council lay the foundation for the direction that we choose.
One thing the government of Hawaii does is they charge a higher property tax rate if it's not your primary residence, but I've been told that's illegal in California.
Well, look, talking about how to disincentivize redevelopment of homes, I think, is a slippery slope. Talking about how we can maintain the character of neighborhoods by reducing massing is probably the appropriate way to be thinking about it. And then we need to be thinking about creative ways to satisfy our housing needs, right? And I don't think the economic forces are such that you can't stop someone from, so fine, you decrease the FAR, someone is still going to be motivated to have a second home here because we've made it an attractive place to live. And so I've tried to think a lot creatively about how exactly what you're thinking about. I just don't think there's a good answer. I think we need to focus our attention on how can we create the right housing based on the needs that we have today.
And so maybe I missed this note, but what are we doing with projects that are like Mr. McGrath's that are a little bit more complex and require 2 months of public works review and that kind of thing? Is the staff considering that, or how is that?
So luckily, we haven't had an instance where two projects are bumped. We haven't maximized the issuance of allotments. With Mr. McGrath's proposal, I'm anticipating that it will be approved in 2016, but it probably will not start construction until 2017. And so what we're considering now is assigning the allotments from both 2016 and 2017 should the Planning Commission choose to approve the project. So we've identified what years those allotments are coming from, and they're both available from the 16 bank and 17 bank, and neither allotment from either year would preclude other projects from also gaining those allotments. Because in 2016, there's also been 3 other units that were approved that have yet to pull building permits. And so if for instance, Mr. McGrath's project was approved in 2016 and they all submitted for building permits this year, we would have 10 submittals for 9 allotments. And so we would run into that issue. But I don't think that any of them are going to actually construct until next year. So I think by splitting the issuance of the allotments, it'll address it. But we've all heard the rumblings of how many, or of the fact that there will be some additional development proposals coming in the next year, and potentially those that will be issuing or looking for more allotments. So that's why staff's trying to get in front of it in order to actually be able to answer those questions when they come up, when there is a crunch.
Right, and so your proposal is that after the general plan is passed, this ordinance gets completely reviewed and, if necessary, revised.
Right, and it's not me, it's really the staff recommendation.
Right.
and
But
the
you're
staff report.
going with that.
Yes.
That's correct. It's broken now, but we were able to limp along, but we know that it's going to be a problem when we get in the next coming years.
Yeah.
But one thing, just from a personal or professional review, is mixed use units may be less attractive as a second home per se, but may allow more folks to have homes, the workforce type. It's a type of apartment unit that could be very nice and very attractive, and actually a lot of millennial types like that because it's in the middle of things, it's walkable. It also cuts down on car use, et cetera, but maybe less desirable as a second home just because it doesn't have some of the features and amenities that second homeowners often look for. So that's just something to consider in your review.
Well, I was going to mention, for instance, in the service commercial, I believe a permitted use that doesn't require a use permit, other than I guess some design review, is to have apartments on top of commercial on the first floor. And I don't know if that's a sort of by right in the downtown core or not. But I think there are a lot of buildings that are nearing the state of obsolete that will be redeveloped in the next decade or two, where we should be encouraging apartments on the second floor, so that it is in that downtown core. It's just smart. It makes sense. While we allow it out in the service commercial, but I don't know if we do there, as a permitted use, doesn't make sense to me. And so I think we should absolutely be exploring that.
Okay.
The other question that, when this growth management system was put in place, and again, I think it's why we need to have a real fresh look, I don't think anyone anticipated the level of traffic and the amount of commuting that we're having when a lot of this system was put in place. And this is new information that's really relevant. And so while we want to restrict the growth, what that's causing is tons of commuting and tons of traffic. And so maybe it is too restrictive, especially if we're talking about building sort of moderate income apartments and or condos that could be sold, but again, restricted in terms of the value appreciation over time. Maybe we should be making some exceptions to get more of that, so we can try to at least, have some impact on the traffic that has been created naturally over time.
I thought that Mr. McGrath's points about the sliding scale are certainly worth pursuing. It seems like what we have today is just too dogmatic. Maybe that's not quite the right word, but too segmented, and there needs to be a little more flexibility. So I would certainly urge looking at that. General, I thought he raised great issues. But at the same time, I remain convinced that the best way to do it is to get the general plan approved and then undertake the comprehensive review, which is going to be very time-consuming, probably requires some outside help too. So.
Yes. So as of today, I just reiterate what I kind of heard as a consensus. Definitely explore options for incentives, but there's not a lot of specific direction yet because there's additional information needed. I'm trying to define workforce housing. would be a good step in allowing a better understanding or maybe better direction for those incentives. Definitely fix the timing of allotments issue.
Right.
And also, rather than, as I put it, or as staff put it, looking for incentivizing things that provide community benefit, what I'm hearing the council is maybe incentivize things that reduce community impacts. That's kind of some of the language. And then consideration of the sliding scale, I saw a lot of nodding heads in that.
Yeah, okay. I think that's fair. Very good. That would take us to our next agenda item, which is a presentation by the police department staff showing the new style of load-bearing and non-load-bearing ballistic vest choices for police officers.
While our chief and lieutenant come up, I just wanted to provide a quick overview. This is one of those sort of different items that we're presenting to the council this evening. The police chief and I believe that it falls within our authority to purchase these vests and provide our employees with the proper uniforms and safety gear, both in public works and as well as police and fire. But this is an opportunity for us to share with the community and the council some things that are happening in departments, especially like the police, that are more visual. And so we're not asking for a decision tonight. We're not looking for you to provide us any authority. What we're trying to do is show you that there's changes in police gear and that we're providing our officers with some options for their health and safety. And so we just wanted to share with you tonight what those options are and what our police officers will be wearing in the near future.
Good.
Thank you, City Manager Phillips. Mr. Mayor, council members, thank you for having us up. Last May, if you'll remember, we came in and I came in and asked for permission to buy new vests for the entire department because all of our vests were at a minimum a year out of compliance and many several older. So with your permission, then we immediately started looking for new styles of vests. The idea being that the ballistic vests provide obviously ballistic protection, but we also wanted to take a look at what would provide the officers with comfort and the ability to care for themselves physically. As you may or may not be aware, the equipment that the officers wear can range anywhere from 30 pounds up, and most of that is on their hips. We do have some weight in the vest, but most of that is on the belts on their hips. And so we immediately started looking for ways to get some of that weight off of their hips. Right now, there's most departments are currently using what is called a covert ballistic vest, which is what I'm wearing. It goes underneath your uniform shirt, and you can tell we're wearing them, but they're under our shirt, and so for the most part, we just look like we're wearing a short sleeve shirt. And they're very functional, but they're also very restrictive. They're tight. They're held on by Velcro, and typically that Velcro is as tight as it can get, and so there's not a lot of movement. They create a lot of body heat, which creates sweat, and on hot days, they really turn into a thermostat, so very uncomfortable to wear. So we started looking at vests that go over the uniform, and they're called overt vests. I wasn't able to get a demonstration model in time, so I did provide a picture of one. But as you can see, it looks just like a uniform shirt, and like the shirt that I'm wearing. The difference is that you would wear your uniform shirt under it. And so from the general public's perspective, just looking at that, you would see my patches, you'd see my badge on the front, you would see everything that you see on me now. You would just have to look a little closer to realize that that's actually over my uniform shirt. That holds the ballistic panels. The benefit to this style of vest is that it's more breathable, it's movable. They actually sell shirts for them now that'll be an option for the officers that go under them, and the collars and the sleeves and the upper portion of the shirt is exactly the same, but what goes under them is a wicking type of shirt that pulls moisture away from your body. Completely invisible to anybody looking at you, but fully functional. And so they're just more comfortable, more breathable. The other benefit to them is that when you're in the station, when you're out of the public contact or potential for public contact, you just take it off. It's just held on with Velcro. You can take the whole thing off, and while you're sitting in the station writing a report or eating your lunch or something, you can take that weight off of your upper body and cool off significantly. And so there's some great benefit to that. What it doesn't do is it does not take the weight off of your hips. And that was one of the priorities I wanted to look at. I wanted to make sure that provided an option for the officers to take the weight off their hips and relieve some of the strain. In addition to that, not everybody can fit all their equipment on the front or sides of their belt, and so sometimes they have it on the back of their belt, which causes sciatic nerve issues and low back problems. And so to be able to get that off of there and put them on the load-bearing vest, we looked at another style, and Lieutenant Hartley is wearing the style that we think works the best for us. It is... The benefit to it is that it allows you to adjust your...
Right. Good.
It allows you to, you didn't realize when you got promoted you'd be doing this. You guys are going to make him rescind his promotion. The benefit to it is that you can move your equipment around with this style of vest. They call it a MOLLE style. The holes that are in it allow you to take that equipment and move it wherever it's functional for you. Left-handed officers need stuff on different sides. Right-handed need it on. And so it's something you have to take into account. You can't have a fixed pocket and just tell them, okay, everybody puts their flashlight here, everybody puts their pepper spray here. It doesn't work that way. It has to be what's functional for the officers. What we tried to avoid was a vest that looks like something that the Army handed down. We're cognizant of that issue at this time in society, and so we found something that we think is very similar to what is on the screen. When you look at it, unless you look really closely, you can't really tell it's not a uniform shirt, except for the equipment hanging off of it. And so it's not as I don't know what the word is, not offensive. It's not as harsh. It looks more like a uniform shirt. It's the same color as a uniform shirt. It doesn't look like a tactical vest like a SWAT member would be wearing. And that's what we were trying to avoid. Is that my 3 minutes? And so what this does do is it allows you to completely take the weight off of your hips. It allows you to take everything off the back of your belt. What stays on your hips in this particular vest style is your firearm and your taser. And there's a reason for that. Those things are something that you have to know where they are when you need it. And I'm not going to go into a lesson on stress management and reactions under stress, but we didn't want to move the gun. So this is not a vest that holds the gun or the taser. This is just a vest that holds the things that you use on a more daily basis: radio, flashlight, pepper spray, handcuffs, those kind of things. There are some studies out that show that there's a significant benefit to wearing something that takes all the weight off of your hips and puts it up onto your shoulders and spreads that weight out evenly over your torso. And of course, this one as well, you can just take off when you're in the station and help cool. So this
How does it feel?
I'm sorry?
How does it feel?
Feels great. Actually, when they had the shooting up in Calistoga, I rolled out. I've had this for about 2 months now. I rolled up there in the middle of the afternoon in summer heat, and everybody else was fine. I was fairly comfortable. That vest there, you can kind of see what's on the inside. It's almost like a cordage, so you do get a lot of breathing out of these vests that you don't get with the older style vests.
Very good. And with these vests, how much weight are you moving up, excluding the firearms, which are staying on the side, but how much weight are you moving up that you would otherwise be carrying on your belt?
Probably, with the ammo and everything, this is fully loaded. And you
Yeah.
can lift it if you want, but it's about 30 pounds.
It's that much,
Yeah.
excluding the firearms.
Correct.
Okay.
The only weight that's staying on the hips is the firearm itself and the taser, and the taser's light. The weight comes from the magazines, the radio, the handcuffs, all these solid metal objects that are fairly heavy, and all of that is going up onto the vest.
Good.
Just curious, have people developed any type of like pants that allow you to put some of the weight on the side of your legs and not on the upper torso?
I'm wearing some. Lieutenant Hartley's wearing some. The pockets on the side are functional. However, there's a couple of problems with that, and that if you have an object on your side and you get into a wrestling match and land on it, you can get injured that way. The other issue is you start to look a little militaristic, SWAT style, drop holsters or straps around your legs. There are departments that carry tasers around their legs, and they've got multiple cartridges that they can carry. We're trying to stay away from any indication or suggestion of that look with this style.
And with that vest, because you've got the protection, the vest itself all this stuff on the front. If you did get into a scuffle, it's not going to ever. Right. Yeah.
And it's not going to come off. It's strapped on there. I thought when we first got this vest, that looks like cheap plastic, and I could pull it apart. You really can't. You can yank on that as hard as you want, it won't tear. And the I'm sorry. The upside to these carriers is that they all contain the same ballistic panel. So the officers will all get new ballistic panels, and if they want the covert, they want that's called a clean, probably because it doesn't have equipment on it, or they want the ballistic or the load bearing. The same panels that we purchase will go into that carrier. So all we're really going to be doing for each individual officer is buying them whatever carrier they're most comfortable with. But we'll all be getting the same vest.
Okay. Very good. And
thank you.
Congratulations on your promotion, by the way, Lieutenant.
Thank you, Mayor.
All right. That takes us to report to the City Council on the regularly scheduled state revolving loan fund payment of $526,805 for the comprehensive flood control project for fiscal year 2016-2017. A favorite subject.
Of course. Thank you, Mayor Galbraith and City Council members. Tonight I am presenting to you an informational item only. Typically, this is not something that we would bring to City Council, but because it does have to do with the flood control project, and as we know, there are so many different facets of this project, we did want to bring it forth as an informational item. So a little bit of background. In 2008, the city did borrow $9.1 million through the state revolving loan fund for the comprehensive flood control project. I'll just refer to this as SRF to make it a little easier and less painful for everybody. Measure A is listed as a source of repayment for the SRF loan. So when we took out the paperwork with SRF, we did state that Measure A funds would be used as a source of payback for this particular loan. The city has been making the payments to SRF since 2008. Most of the payments did come from what is known as Fund 235. However, some payments have come from the general fund. These payments are scheduled to be made through 2028. However, as presented to City Council earlier this year, we are looking at an early payoff dependent on Measure A drawdowns. Looking for my clicker. For the SRF payment, our SRF payment is due each November. So in November 2016, the SRF payment of just short of $526,000 will be made. For fiscal year 16-17, we did anticipate revenues from Measure A of $1.4 million, and that is still the anticipated revenue. The revenues are to be used for the regular payment of just short of $527,000, as well as an additional principal payment to SRF of approximately $831,000, and that was per the terms of our agreement with SRF. The revenues and expenditures were both budgeted in fiscal year 16 and 17, and I believe if you're looking at the budget document, that was on page 63 of the budget document. For the, I know, just pulled that one out. For the Measure A drawdown, I was going to ask you that. I did a little research, and I think it's in the staff report. For the Measure A drawdown, it is dependent on several different factors. The first is the completion of our audit for our previous expenditures that we did draw down from Measure A, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. The second is submission of qualifying expenditures for the to the Flood Control District and the Financial Oversight Committee. I'll just refer to that as FOC. And then the third is actually doing a contract amendment to include SRF repayment as an allowable expenditure. This is something that was not done previously. Other cities around us, they all have SRF, and it is an allowable expenditure, but we never went through the formal process of doing that with the FOC. Where we currently are in the Measure A drawdown, under the audit for previous expenditures, the city staff, we have been working with the county to complete the audit for the previous expenditures. The city, as you know, did retain the services of NIGRO and NIGRO to conduct a forensic audit of this project, and this is estimated to be completed by the end of this calendar year, so December 31st. And as you recall, the the contract with Nigro and Nigro is because of the complexity of this project. We wanted to ensure that we were presenting the most accurate information we can. As stated in the last council meeting, as Tracy Prokowski did a grants update, staff is holding off on submitting the paperwork, the required paperwork for the Measure A audit until the forensic accounting firm has had a chance to thoroughly vet and review the information. And that, again, is so we can make sure that we are submitting the most accurate information we can to the County Financial Oversight Committee as well as our other funding sources. For the SRF payment, during the development of the fiscal year 16-17 budget, staff did anticipate that all required audits and amendments for Measure A would be completed prior to November 2016 SRF payment. However, due to the timing of the forensic audit report, the Measure A audit, and contract amendments, the drawdown is not going to be able to take place prior to the November 2016 payment being done. A drawdown is anticipated prior to the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th. However, because of those extraneous circumstances, it is not guaranteed. So we do want to just make the council aware of that because as scheduled, we are going to be making the regular scheduled payment at the end of October, early November. For proper accounting principles, so GAAP principles, we are allowed to do this because it's a budgeted item. We are anticipating the revenues, so it is something that we would typically do over a course of business. However, because of the different facets of this, we did want to make the city council aware that it's not a guarantee that we can't draw it down, but we are anticipating that we can. It is also important to note that at this time we are only making the 526 required payment. We are not making any additional principal payments until we actually have the money in our funds. As stated earlier, this is an informational item. There are 2 items for the City Council just to be aware of. If for some reason the drawdown cannot be done prior to the end of our fiscal year of June 30th, one of 2 things will need to happen, and which of the 2 items that will happen is really dependent on where the city is at in the contract amendment process. So the first is that could potentially happen is the 526,805, which is the regular scheduled payment, will be transferred from the general fund reserves to Fund 35 to cover that payment. This would bring the general fund reserves to approximately 18%. Right now we're right about 24%. This would bring it down to 18%. City Manager Phillips and I both discussed this, and until we know for sure the drawdown, council items that will come before City Council that talk about the reserve levels, if we're dipping into reserves, we are going to present 2 scenarios to the City Council, what it will look like if we do not have to take from reserves and what it would look like if we did. So I wanted to make you aware of that. The other item that would happen, if the first item didn't happen, the second one, again, dependent on where we are in the process, is the general fund could potentially loan Fund 235 the $527,000, and then the loan will be paid when Measure A funds are received. At that point on our books, it is booked as a long-term or short-term receivable, so it would not affect the net position. So again, which scenario would have to happen is definitely dependent on where in the process, the amendment process we are. If a general fund reserve drawdown or a general fund reserve is necessary, city staff will definitely bring that in front of City Council but via resolution for approval. Again, informational report only, and we're asking a receive and file, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Let me ask one question here. Focusing on the slide that says the additional principal payment to SRF of approximately $831,000, where do we stand with SRF in terms of dealing with advancing the loan payment schedule? And is this $831,000 tied up in that?
The $831,000 would not be tied up in that. As far as where we are at with SRF, we have been conversing with them every week, if not every other week. They've been requesting information. We've been providing information to them, but at this point we do not have a final resolution on what type of repayment schedule that they would be requesting from us.
Well, with respect to this $831,000 additional principal payment, I guess I'm confused as to how it relates or doesn't relate to the regular payment of $526,000.
It does not relate to the regular payment. If you look at the fiscal year 16-17 budget, you will see that we have expenditures of almost $1.4 million. So portion of that is the 526 regular payment, and then the other portion is the additional principal payment. So in regards to the staff report, it's a secondary item. It's not related to the actual regular payment.
I guess, so the additional principal payment was part of the loan documentation?
No, it's the situation that came about with the Department of Water Resources grant. Part of the issue is that when we received monies for SRF, the SRF loan document says that any time the city received monies from those sources of funds, payment was supposed to go straight to SRF. And that's one of the things that we didn't do. And so every time we receive a Measure A drawdown, that money needs to basically move right to SRF. And so what we're saying is, if the drawdown occurs at the $1.4 million,
Okay, I got it.
all that money's got to go. Can't sit in Fund 235. The city can't hold on to it. It can't do any other projects, any flood control related projects. It has to go straight to repay the loan, which is one of the reasons we believe we're going to be able to repay the SRF loan early and save a significant amount of money in those administrative fees. So that's what we're saying, is they're tied together. We're required by language in the SRF to pay down the loan. That was part of the problem with the Department of Water Resources loan, or the grant. That should have gone also to pay down the SRF loan. And so that's where we want to be. So we're providing you a lot of information in one staff report. And what we're trying to do is have a better job of leaving history for those who come after us. And so a lot of these staff reports are also intended that if someone needs to figure out what's going on, there's a staff report that outlines all that. So we're sorry if it's a little confusing.
Well, it's not confusing to you. I just needed the clarification, and that was perhaps just me. So, in any event, thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions. I know that we want to have the forensic audit done and have that sort of submitted before we request this drawdown, or that was the plan when we thought it would be done in a more timely fashion. Now that it hasn't, it's taking longer. Can we deviate from that plan and request the drawdown given our current fiscal situation is sort of question number one. And question number two is, if we can't do that, can we request an extension so that we can time this payment to the SRF with the drawdown from Measure A funding?
At this point, it would not be possible to be able to do a Measure A drawdown in time to make the payment because of the different things that we have to do. We have to complete our audit with the county first. From there, then we could do the contract amendment, which would have to go to the Financial Oversight Committee. So at this point, timing-wise, that wouldn't be possible. As far as the requesting an extension, I can ask SRF that. We have not reached out to them for that. We are trying to stay on good graces with them because of some of the other issues we've had with this, but I can definitely reach out to them and ask if they would grant an extension on us making the payment.
An interest-free extension.
Well, it would accrue. I mean, we're going to catch up on a lot of that, and I understand trying to stay in their good graces, but I think it's just, otherwise we further, deplete and reduce our general fund reserves. And if there's a willingness on their part that doesn't have an adverse impact on our relationship such that we can continue on our payment plan, I mean, if you don't ask, you don't get, right? And it would put us in a better position, a less risky position, I think. And we are doing the work. We did hire the forensic accountant. We're trying to get the audit done. It's not that we're not doing it. We are doing it. We can probably show them that. But does it hurt to ask, I guess, the question?
That's the $64,000.
That's a big question. We'll talk to Ms. Prokosky, who's been the main liaison with the SRF folks, and see sort of what the temperature might be to ask a question like that. A couple things come about here again. One of the challenges that we have is, unfortunately, the backup documentation for all the prior drawdowns to Measure A was never provided nor requested by the county. And so it's one of the reasons we're in the position we're in, because now that there have been questions about both the Department of Water Resources and the SRF loan, the county's doing its due diligence, as it should, and so we're required to do that. And so that's an important process for us to go through and be respectful of, that they're doing what they should have been doing, and it's appropriate for them to request that audit of us. The timing on the audit, it's just a very voluminous project, and so it's a little bit behind schedule, but it's not really that much behind schedule. You know, we knew this would be a little bit of a challenge. Also, the two scenarios that Director Mitz presented fundamentally do not affect the general fund in the long term. We will get the drawdown. There's no question we're going to get the drawdown. It's just the timing of it, and so that's why we suggest the opportunity to potentially do the loan, which then in the CAFR would keep the general fund reserve at a higher percentage versus doing having the general fund pay for it and pulling it out of reserve, which then would show a much lower fund balance, which is not good for our credit rating and our overall financial health. So we do have some options there. One of the other things that we talked about was trying to initiate the process to do the contract amendment now so that we can get that on the agenda for the COF, is that what you call it? FOC. And so that we don't, we sort of were looking at things in sequence, but we realized maybe we could leapfrog that one over and get that done. So as soon as the audit by the county is done, we've already got permission to use, to have the SRF loan be part of that agreement and use of funds for Measure A, and we could immediately make that then happen. So we're trying to be as thoughtful as possible to preserve the general fund reserve.
I guess another strategy is, when do we, here's the date by which we think we'll have the audit done, and we'll be able to put in the request for the Measure A drawdown and pay you. But if we don't hit that, then we'll pay you no matter what. But that, like, give them a request, a time request, versus, we just need an extension. Actually do the give them all the information. This is why we need it. We expect to have it done by then. If for some reason the Measure A drawdown hasn't happened, then we'd make the loan from the general fund. And so put a date, sort of terminus on it, versus just asking for a sort of open-ended extension.
And keep in mind, they're still reviewing the council's request of the repayment of the $2.1 million, and we had a fairly favorable, we presented fairly favorable terms to SRF, favorable to us, of very low payments in the beginning, ramping up later as hopefully our financial condition improves. And so that's been heavily scrutinized, as Director Mitz said. They've asked us a lot of questions. I'm not sure we're in great standing with them at this time, and so I wouldn't want to jeopardize that and in any way have them look at that and say, well, gosh, we can't even make this loan payment. We better get in there and get the $2.1 million more quickly, because you're obviously not even able to make what you're committed to make.
Well, how does that, so and I was sort of wondering about that. We've got this request in for a restructured loan payment where it ramps up over time. How does that dovetail with this payment?
It's totally separate.
How does it mesh?
We haven't heard.
No, I know we haven't heard, but if we were under that repayment plan at this point in time, would we be paying this much, or would we be paying less?
If we were under that payment plan, we would actually be paying more. So we would have the regular $527,000 payment in November. In addition to that, I believe the first year we proposed an additional $75,000 payment.
Right.
That $75,000 payment, any additional payments for that 2.1 must come from the general fund, where the regular scheduled payment of $827 can come from Measure A funds. So that's what the difference is. So that one is unrelated. It's in addition to this. One would be funded from Measure A. The repayment schedule that we're proposing would all be from the general fund.
Right.
I have just a fundamental basic question for my understanding. So it was anticipated when we took out the $9 million loan that we would be using Measure A funds to pay it back, correct? How many more years will we be able to access Measure A funds, and is it sufficient to pay off the loan? When are we going to pay off the loan?
The loan is originally scheduled to be paid off in 2028. However, Measure A sunsets at the end of 2018. So
Okay.
I don't know what
Then
the
what?
intentions. I don't know what the intentions were at the time that they took out the SRF loan. Based on
That's
how
a more
much,
fundamental, bigger issue in my mind.
based on
And
how
this
much
one.
was estimated to be collected for Measure A, if that money is turned around, paid right towards SRF, it would have probably been about even. But I don't know the intentions when they did the.
So the general fund will be impacted likely, right?
We believe if
At
we
that
make the early, if we make the early, in the original documentation or the original loan, we don't understand how they did a loan to 2028 with Measure A ending in 2018, and we just don't understand that. Our plan is to take the Measure A money, as soon as it's drawn down each time, transition it right into SRF as we're supposed to do. And because we save almost $1 million in administrative fees, we believe there will be adequate, if the economy stays good and the revenue comes in as we project, we believe we can pay off the entire SRF loan with Measure A monies. And we'll be done with it. Except the $2.1 million coming from the general fund. That's our hope. Or our plan. Maybe it's both.
That had been the prior plan, or you don't know?
The what?
Could that have been the prior plan, or you just don't know?
Well, the question is, I don't see how you are in compliance with the loan agreement with SRF. The loan agreement says every time you receive the revenues that are intended to repay the loan, you couldn't have put them in Fund 235 and held them and only made the 528 payment. You would have been, and we were, in violation of the SRF loan. So we just don't know. We don't understand. Or they thought that the city would be in better condition and they would make the remaining payments with the general fund. I mean, that's what the general fund is. That's why it's so important, because it's always the backstop to everything that we do. And maybe that was their thought. We just don't know.
They must, I mean, when SRF wrote it, if the payment plan that exists today went through 2028 and Measure A sunsets in 2018, they must have been trying to give us flexibility to repay it over a longer period, perhaps not just through, but we can't use the Measure A funds for anything else unless we had other projects. If we had other projects, then we could. So it might have been set up to say, you can use these dollars for other projects and then pay us off over a longer period of time, which would require you to use other sources of revenue to do so, because you'd be accruing more interest.
Well,
but that's your choice. I think maybe they were trying to give us the flexibility. Who knows?
Well, there certainly were other Measure A projects, obviously, up by the corporate yard and so on, so, that have not been funded. And
Right.
the Measure A money won't be there to fund them at this point, so.
Right.
But, yeah, all those are good questions. But in terms of approaching SRF, my bottom line is don't do anything to rock the boat. It's a tender situation.
I agree with the mayor.
How long ago did we put the request in for the restructure?
Oh, offhand,
I feel like it was 6+ months
I
ago.
feel like it was back in March or April. I'd have to relook at the council reports. I believe it seems like it was about 6 months ago. We submitted things to them, called them, didn't hear a response, and then recently we've heard a flurry of responses. So at this point, we've gone back and forth probably over about the past month, a couple times a week.
But they've been in communication on this restructure.
Yes.
Okay. And we don't know if they're favorably or unfavorably inclined to do it.
At this point, we don't have an indication, just asking a lot of questions, I think more for clarification, as well as we're providing clarification to them for some things that we might not have been seeing eye to eye, so we've been doing a lot of clarification lately.
So for the public's sake, if we decide to make the loan out of the general fund and make this payment, these are dollars we have to repay at some point from some source, right? And we can do it proactively or be forced to do it, right? And so just addressing the mayor's comment here to not rock the boat, and we'd only have to make that loan if for some reason the Measure A drawdown didn't occur by the end of the fiscal year, right?
And it would be repaid by Measure A. So as soon as a drawdown occurs, Measure A is the repayment vehicle to the general fund.
Yeah.
So hopefully that comes then shortly thereafter, and the loan is 2 months or 3 months at most, we hope, and then we're back to normal.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. We move on to the next. Let me open it up for public comment.
Public limping along here. I just am a little confused. I thought I heard you say that the 500 and whatever thousands of dollars were already budgeted, so those were going to be paid on time. It was the 841,000 that's in question here. Is that accurate, or am I wrong?
No, the five.
Let me ask you to sit down, and then staff can
I have
respond.
another question.
Well, why don't you get your other question out, too?
Okay, the other one was, I thought that you mentioned also in the report that something was waiting on the audit from the county. I was wondering how much control, if any, we have over getting that audit completed.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. The 526,805, so the regularly scheduled payment, that was in our budget. So that was a budgeted item. However, it comes from Fund 235. So we have to have revenues in and we have expenditures out in Fund 235. So at this point, we are going to be making the regularly scheduled payment of 526 without having the revenues in. And that is allowable by what they call GAAP standards of accounting. So that's where the 526 is. Does that answer?
Just go ahead and complete your answer.
And then as far as the audit from the county goes, the audit from the county, we have been working with the county. At this point, it is dependent on us getting them information, them completing the audit, and giving us back the audit report.
Okay, good. Is there any further council comment here? All right, then we'll move on to item number 19, which is professional standards established by the ICMA, whose offices are in Washington, D.C., right behind the U.S. Capitol.
Yes, they
I
are.
can visualize them.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that I've been asked in over the 2 years that I've been here, as we've been discovering a lot of the challenges that St. Helena's had, is how are we going to keep this from happening again? That's what the community wants to know. The council's asked me that question, each of you independently, and I've asked myself that question. And so as I've hired my team, I've looked at the kind of individuals that I believe are the professionals that meet my standards. But I talked about that, and when I talked to some council members and I talked to the community, what does that mean? Where do my standards come from? And so I just wanted to take a few moments of the council's time to talk a little bit about ICMA. It's the International City County Management Association. And I've been a member for 13 years. The entire time I've been a member in good standing. And it's an association that those of us in public administration, and especially in city management, county management, I think take quite seriously. And the purpose of the association is really to provide us with not only support in what's a very challenging profession, but also to give us guidelines. And I've attached to the staff report the Code of Ethics, which was adopted. ICMA started in 1914. The Code of Ethics was adopted shortly thereafter. And the purpose is to give us guidelines, and a lot of it has to do, because we're functioning in a political environment, it gives us guidelines not only professionally on how to conduct ourselves, but also in the political environment that we're in every day. And so what I found so interesting when I was sort of re-looking at ICMA and the purpose of the organization, I was really struck by a statement that I wrote in the staff report. And it says, the management decisions made by ICMA members affects millions of individuals living in thousands of communities, from small villages and towns to large metropolitan areas. And to me, that was a really impactful statement, because it's those of us who are leading our communities and helping our staffs do great work, and helping the councils that we serve, our elected officials, make good decisions, to provide you with information so that you can make good policy decision and be good legislators. And so that's really where my foundation of ethics comes from. And I'm very committed to the ICMA Code of Ethics. I've shared it with my entire exec staff. We've discussed it. I've shared it with my middle managers as well. And many of my managers have shared it with their teams, so that the organization understands how important these standards are. It's something that we're all committed to. And I think that's what you are seeing now, and the community seeing in professional public administration and professional management, is things we're going to make mistakes. I've said that the entire time that I've been here, but our mistakes are going to be because we missed something, or we were too busy to catch a mistake, or I have a staff report that I'm going to make a correction in, and it was just something that I missed in writing my next staff report. But they're going to be made with the best of our abilities. They're going to be made ethically. Our work is going to be as professional as we can possibly make it for you in the community. And that's what I pride myself on. And so when you look at the quality of work that's been coming forward, the professionalism, the ethical values that we have, and our deep desire and commitment to the public process. And I think tonight, by pure happenstance, I think tonight is an excellent example of this team's desire to communicate with you and the community, to show you what's going on. The vests are a perfect example. again, that falls within my authority under a manager council form of government, but I want to share those things with you. I want you to know what's going on in the organization. I want you to see some of those impactful decisions that we're making at an operations level. The staff report you just heard from Director Mintz. We absolutely have total authority to make the SRF payment, and there's no obligation legally for us to come forward and provide that staff report for you tonight. But again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to show you what we're doing. We're trying to show you the decisions that we're challenged with. We're trying to show you the things that are coming forward so that you can also make good decisions and you know what's coming forward in the organization when you're making your policy decisions and the community understands some of the challenges that we have. And that's really been my style. And so, they talk a lot about things in our culture in America. One of the things that we have to do when we look at ethics is we have to give up this notion that things are okay to do just because they're simply permissible or legal. I move beyond that. I won't do something just because it's permissible or legal. I look at it and say, is that ethical? Is that the right thing to do? Does that include the community? Are we working in community and having the community participate and be part of our process? And that's very much the core of who we are as a team. And those are the kinds of things that I can share with you as a council in the community to say things are different. And I hope that you've seen a difference and we're committed to that difference as we move forward together in the years ahead. And so I hope that maybe helps you and the community understand that we are trying, and I do believe that things are different and hopefully better.
Have any communities adopted, and can we adopt policy that requires that certain leadership roles be ICMA members? So that the code of ethics is almost a requirement, adopting that and acknowledging that code of ethics is almost a requirement to employment?
I think you certainly can. I think if that's something that the council would like to do, we could bring back as part of one of our policies on recruitment that any exec staff member is a member of ICMA. It's an expensive membership, but if that's something that's, I would support that wholeheartedly. And keep in mind, too, that each executive member, the beauty of ICMA is that it's sort of this overarching organization, and each of my exec staff is a member of their own professional association. So April's a member of CSFMO, California Municipal Finance Officers Association. Cindy's a member of the City Clerks Association. Noah's a member of the Planning Directors, California Planning something or other. There we go. And Steve's a member of American Public Works Association. And so that's also part of, then they too have code of ethics and generally guidelines for conduct within their own associations. And I am very supportive of membership and encourage that and encourage the training. Because partially what it does is it engages us with our colleagues. And so when we talk about sort of the things that remind us of who we are and our decision making, when you're going to conferences and you're seeing your colleagues and you're doing your professional education and development and you're connecting with this network, it sort of rises you up and keeps you in this sort of what I consider this upper echelon of people who are saying, we're doing right by our communities. I mean, every presentation I make when I teach, no matter what the topic, I will always put a little wedgie of ethics in there. I have to. I can't help myself. And you'll find that at our conferences as well. There's almost always a discussion about ethics and how important that is. And so those are the kinds of things. I mean, in a job description or in our HR manual, we could certainly have a council policy that says, we abide by the ICMA Code of Ethics, and we expect you at a minimum to be a member of your professional association, and preferably as well with ICMA. I also neglected to mention that one of the programs that ICMA has is a credentialed city manager program. As you start to look at city manager recruitment, you're starting to see councils put that in the recruitment brochures. Highly desirable as a credentialed city manager. I've applied for and been recommended to receive my credentialing, and I'll be receiving that this month. And it requires a peer review and then annual professional development on my part to stay committed to the profession and my lifelong learning in this profession. So absolutely, those would be things that we could definitely look at.
It just seems to me that having that level of ethical responsibility on a forward basis almost required is a safeguard, right? And if it so that we can avoid mistakes that maybe have been made in the past, right?
Well, and I'm peer reviewed, and so if I do something in my conduct that my peers believe is not ethical and does not meet the code of ethics, and I violate one of the tenets, ICMA can be notified, and an investigation will be conducted on me, and I can be censured either privately or publicly. And so there's sort of this extra review to say, we're watching you. And unfortunately, there have been some city managers out there that have made some very poor decisions, and it doesn't serve our profession well at all. And so it's important that those of us that are committed to ICMA and the Code of Ethics, that we continue to carry what I think are the vast majority of committed professionals in this profession, and what I believe, I'm so privileged, and I think my team feels the same way, that we're so privileged to be in this profession and to serve our communities, that we continue that high standard.
Just a comment here. You mentioned professional development, and when I was looking at the guidelines, I underscored each member should commit at least 40 hours per year to professional development activities that are based on the practices identified by the members of the ICMA. So that's not a small commitment. That's 40 hours a year, and that keeps these members at the state of the art, ethically and practically. So I think it's hugely important that our city manager be a member, and I'm very struck by the fact that she will soon be a credentialed member, if I have the distinctions down correctly.
That is, yes.
Is there any other comment? Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, any public comment? Sure.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering, does the city pay for the membership? And is there a state board that would be doing such investigations as you talked about? Is that part of the credentialing?
So yes, the city pays for my membership. It's actually in my employment contract. That's how important it is to me. It's one of the things that I negotiated when I came here, the ability to go to the ICMA conference, which unfortunately the first 2 years I haven't been able to do due to workload. But I'm grateful that the city does that, and it was important to me. I quite frankly would not have worked for a city that didn't support my membership in ICMA.
Just wait a minute. Go ahead and complete, please.
The second question was, is there a state board? ICMA has a California branch. It's called Cal ICMA. And so because they are located on the East Coast, and quite frankly in California, we pay some of the highest dues because it's based on salary. We felt that we needed closer connection and more services, so we created Cal ICMA. I participated in Cal ICMA on the board early when it first started, I want to say 10 years ago. I have served on several committees. I've served on the board. And so I'm continue to be also an active member of Cal ICMA. And they too, one of the subcommittees or committees on Cal ICMA is an ethics review committee. So I can be reviewed by my peers in California as well as nationally.
But it's not a state agency.
It's
It's an independent agency. And I think the question that Bobby is asking is, like the Department of Real Estate oversees all real estate agents. And here we have, city managers are it's partially funded by sales tax. It's, we're a government community. And is there any agency that overlooks or watches city managers, much like we watch real estate professionals, as an example, right?
I don't quite get the question because that's what ICMA does.
Right, but is there a state-based agency, not in the state of California, but a state government agency that has sort of this watchdog task?
No. Oh, I see. Separate from ICMA.
Correct.
No.
Yeah, okay.
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I mean, the League of California Cities has a city manager association.
Right.
And so as being part of it, the city is a member of the League of California Cities. And within that, like the city attorney's department, there's a city manager's department. So there is a group, but it's not an oversight.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, good. Any further discussion? Okay.
Other than that, I think it'd be good to have a long-term policy or bring it back for discussion of having ICMA sort of be a requirement of our city managers so that when we're all gone, it's codified in sort of our hiring practices.
I would highly recommend it.
Good. Okay, good. Thank you so much. This takes us to item 20, council discussion of Measure D and potential budget adjustments. Ms. Phillips.
All right. So I have to say, to start out, this was probably one of the more difficult staff reports that I've had to write in my career. And I'm sorry that it's just a challenging time for St. Helena. And I hope that this staff report is helpful basically in, again, bringing some history all into one place. All the attachments that I included are to sort of lay out the process that we've been through together over the last 2 years has sort of culminated into this staff report today. In early 2015, I started having the communication with the council and the community that there appeared to be some financial challenges for the city. And I first did that through the city's first long-range financial forecast. And I shared with you that basically there were inadequate revenues to cover the expenses, and there were many, many, many things that had been neglected in St. Helena over the years, and that we were coming to a point where we really needed to deal with some of these unmet needs within the community. At the goal setting in 2015, we had a long conversation, spent the day together, and we talked about where we were financially. And the council basically made its number one goal and only goal out of that goal session was to secure the city's financial future. We had some strategic objectives related to that, but I really had my marching orders from the council on moving forward and looking to secure the city's financial future. When we put together the 15-16 budget, shockingly, we were looking at $1 million that we had to cut out of the general fund. We were over budget in our initial budget presentation by $1 million in our draft budget. Our general fund reserve at that time was around 23%. We got through it through very painful discussions. The council saw that we just couldn't overspend and we couldn't draw from reserves, and so we were able to make the cuts necessary. However, despite the belt tightening, we spent over $600,000 in 15-16 because so many unexpected expenses came up. And the story behind that is you can budget as carefully as you want to, but you know that you're going to have unexpected expenditures. Mm-hmm. And so just because we were able to deliver and adopt a balanced budget doesn't mean that we didn't need additional funds. And so again, that revenue, we don't have adequate revenue to cover the expenses and the kinds of expenses that we have on an annual basis. Recognizing the challenges that we were facing in September 2015, the council created this ad hoc revenue source task force. That task force met for many months. We presented as staff a lot of information about the city's financial conditions and revenue options. The task force wrote a report which was delivered to council in February, basically stating that yes, the city needed to look at additional revenue options, and they made several recommendations, and that report is also attached to the staff report. We did another update in February 2016 of the long-range financial forecast. Although we saw modest increases in revenues, our expenditures still outpace our revenues, and many, many things in the city remain neglected and deteriorated, and we need to begin to address those. So in February 2016, we conducted another council goal setting. The goal of securing the financial security of the city remained, and so we remained focused on that. At that time, we talked about several different revenue options, and over the months of March through June, staff brought forward several options for the council to consider. And ultimately, the council made the decision to move forward with a sales tax initiative. In our 16-17 budget, your executive staff worked very hard to present a status quo budget. Our general fund reserve in that 16-17 budget still remains below the 25%, which is an informal council goal. And we still have the $2.1 million that we just discussed a few items ago that we have a repayment to the state revolving loan fund for, and we're struggling. We are not a functional organization. We are struggling. We are struggling to meet many of the things that we need to do, both for the community and legally. And so our status quo budget does not get us to the level that we need to be at. On July 12th, 2016, the council did approve the submission of the ballot measure. It has been labeled Measure D, and that is for the half-cent sales tax to be voted on by the citizens of St. Helena in November 2016, this coming election. We're not alone in this struggle. many cities in California. There's 461 cities in California. 3 have filed for bankruptcy, and many are struggling. Our revenues have not recovered to the levels that we all had hoped, and our expenses, quite frankly, are outpacing our revenues. And so if you take some comfort in that, it's not like there's 460 cities doing great and Little St. Helena is the only one struggling. Many cities are struggling, and there's some reasons behind that, and I listed those in the staff report. Passage of Proposition 13 was one of the starts of the state coming in and affecting the city's ability to raise revenue. The state legislature continues to pass legislation that requires and mandates cities to provide certain services or do certain things with no funding to support those additional mandates. Regulatory requirements. We've been in this chamber many times with you now discussing the regulatory requirements that we have, especially with the water and the wastewater facilities. There is no funding for that. Those are requirements that are placed upon us again by the state or the federal government, and we must comply with them. A supermajority vote was passed by the voters in California that requires any specific revenue, any specific tax initiatives to get a 2/3 vote if you have specific uses for those. The Great Recession had a huge impact on us. Employee pensions and PERS investment strategies of a rate of return of around 7% that they're not able to meet. And so that obligation and those unfunded liabilities continue to grow for public agencies. Back in the early 90s, it was the ERAF shift, the Education Revenue Augmentation Fund. And that's after voters said a certain percentage of the state budget must go to education. And the state had to find the money to be able to meet that initiative that was passed by the voters. And again, they took that from property tax and they took that from the cities. And so those kinds of things that have happened in the last 20 plus or more years, 30, 40, have sort of led to the struggles that many cities in California are facing. We in St. Helena, with all the other cities in California, we have many, many obligations and responsibilities. And if you're in a business, you have these too. We have more, but you as a business owner or someone working in a business also recognize the impacts and the requirements that the federal and state governments have been putting on us. And some of your local businesses would say some of those regulations are ours, and those are causing our businesses costing our businesses additional monies. And so we have regulations, and I put a huge list just as a small example of the things that we're required to do, both from a state perspective and from a federal perspective. When the feds passed the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, there were things that we had to do with our water runoff. You could have a 100-year-old facility, and you were still required to comply. It's just the way that it is, and so you have to do things to stay compliant with these things. Americans with Disabilities Act. It's not a statement of whether they're the right things to do or not. It's that we have to, whether you agree with it or not, we're legally required to do that. And the list is extensive. And basically compliance is not an option. It's absolutely mandatory. And so running a business, running a city costs money. And that is basically done through people. Our own code and our own regulations require us to have the staffing and the revenue necessary to make sure people are complying with our own code. NOAA gets calls daily, weekly on, there's a sign, someone's violating the sign ordinance. Can't you come out and look at this code enforcement problem? Can't you look at this? Can't you do that? You wrote the law, can't you make sure someone abides by it? Parking enforcement, those types of things. We don't have the staff to do that. We just don't. And our code enforcement right now is basically on health and safety matters. If it's really aesthetics or things that are just an annoyance, quite frankly, we just can't come out. And so we can't even support our compliance with our own laws. And so these are some of the challenges that we're facing. And so when the community says, well, why do you have to do those things? Why do you have to add staff? Why do you have to have that much money? Why can't you just provide the services that I want and forget about the rest? It's because to run a local government agency, there's a minimum base of work that you absolutely must do to have a legally functioning local government agency, and we're required to do those things. And quite again, those things are done through people. We have to have the adequate staff and resources to be able to be in compliance with all of the things that we need to be in compliance with. Locally, we've made some decisions that have also had an impact on how we got to where we are. And again, this is not a statement of whether I agree or disagree with those decisions. It's the historical documentation of how we got to where we are today. And those decisions have resulted in some of the challenges that we're facing. Inadequate revenue. We do not have enough general fund revenue to cover the expenses that we have to provide the services that the community is looking for and to be able to run a compliant government. We have insufficient reserves in the general fund. We talked today at a meeting with our ad hoc revenue source task force about the water and the wastewater rates. We have insufficient reserves in both the water and the wastewater funds. We have a lack of capital replacement funds. I've talked about this repeatedly. Every time I present the long-range financial forecast, along with the budget, we have put no monies aside for any type of capital replacement. So anytime we have to repair a building, anytime we have to buy any equipment, anytime we have to replace a vehicle, anytime we have to do any of those things, we have to find money from our ongoing operating revenues because we've put no money aside. Normal, standard, effective government would have said, we bought a new police cruiser and it cost us $25,000 and we think it's going to last for 10 years. At the point that we purchase that, we create a fund and a certain amount of money goes into that fund over a 10-year period so that when that vehicle reaches its end of its useful life, the monies are available in that fund and you go out and you buy that replacement vehicle. We have done that for nothing. No computer equipment, no large equipment, not a street sweeper, not a vehicle, nothing. And we've used many of our things beyond its useful life. We've not done that for our park equipment. We've not done that for any of our buildings. And so we have no savings account to make any kind of improvements to any of our capital assets that we hold. And we've allowed our infrastructure to seriously depreciate. When you look at things like the park bathrooms, when you look at things like City Hall, when you look at things like the street and the infrastructure under the street, it's just like your own house. If you buy a house brand new and you do nothing to it for 30 years, the cost of your repairs is so much higher, you suddenly realize you have to gut your entire bathroom, or you have to replace all the pipes in your house, or you have to replace all the electrical because you did nothing for 30 years. Our city buildings are no different. And basically we didn't do proper maintenance and we didn't care for, we deferred our maintenance because we didn't have adequate revenue. And now the cost of repairs is substantially higher. You can't just replace the faucet on the sink anymore because the entire pedestal in the bathroom has deteriorated beyond being able to be repaired. And that's far more costly than if you'd replaced the faucet after the first 5 years when it started leaking. Now it's dry rot through your whole cabinet and you have to replace the whole thing. It's the same thing that we've done with our capital assets here in St. Helena. And so our repair of these assets will be far more costly. The other thing we never did, and we don't have staff to do it yet, is to have an asset management program. We have no idea what our assets are. That question's been asked here publicly. It's been asked by council members. It's been asked by Steve and I. How do we manage our assets if we don't know what they are? And we're trying, but we don't have that asset management plan. And so that's another huge deficiency that we also need to have. We have an obligation and a responsibility to care for the buildings and the equipment and the infrastructure that the community has entrusted upon us, and we haven't done a good job. We've also made some decisions in the past that have positively impacted our finances. We've done things like purchasing the Adams Street parcel, and the staff report that was originally printed said for $2 million. The correct number is $3 million. We used $1 million in general fund monies, and we took out a loan for $2 million to purchase that parcel. That parcel is now worth $12 million, so it was a great return on our investment. The Los Alcobas Hotel was approved, and we've talked repeatedly that the revenue coming from the TOT of that hotel is a significant benefit to the budget and to our financial condition. Without that revenue, the city would be in much more serious condition. and our budget situation will have looked very different even for the adoption of the 16-17 budget. There have been a variety of other things. We purchased the Railroad Avenue property, so we have an additional piece of property for some flexibility. Passage of Measure A, that was important for our flood control project, and significant water and wastewater rate increases were approved by the council in 2011. However, despite these positive financial decisions, we still have some real challenges. Mentioned earlier in one of our items, and I just point that out in the staff report, is the fire department. I'm very concerned about the future of that model and the ability to continue to have a part-time fire department, and housing is one of the most critical elements of that. And if we're not able to come up with different solutions to be able to support our part-time firefighters, we will have to at some point look at a full-time model. And we're looking at well over $1 million to make that transition, if not more, into the $2 million range, on top of the modest budget that we currently have for our fire department. Other decisions that have been made in the past have put a strain on our finances. We built a $37 million flood control project, and we've put millions of dollars from the general fund into that project. There weren't funds available to be able to do that. Unfortunately, the city didn't adopt any rate increases for 20 years for the water and the wastewater systems, and they deteriorated significantly. And now the cost to make those improvements, when we presented the proposed rate increases this afternoon to the task force, and we bring those forward, it's far more expensive now to make those improvements instead of having made them over that 20-year period when we didn't do any rate increases. We've operated a beloved, locally funded, but regionally serving library. And many communities don't have the privilege of having that. And that was a community decision that was made, but it has had a financial impact on our city. There has been a lack of financial controls and transparency to fully understand the city's financial position. I believe that the council truly didn't understand in years past where you were, and the community didn't understand. And so a lot of the information that we've been bringing forward has been quite shocking. And so the reporting that we're now doing is important for the health of our community. Again, the deferred and inadequate infrastructure. We've done limited economic development and tourism-related initiatives. Again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that those decisions have had an impact on the financial condition of this organization and the community. And there's been opposition to revenue-generating options such as a sales tax and hotel development. Those are revenue-generating decisions, and again, this is not an opinion. It's a financial history of what got us into the position that we're in today. And so I've been saying since January 2016 that I believe that this year is one of the most pivotal years in St. Helena's history. We have some big decisions to make together, and we are at a crossroad. And the council and the community has to make some decisions on some very big things that are coming before it. We have an updated general plan. There's been some initial discussion about some hotel developments, and they'll be coming before the city council. The availability of affordable and workforce housing, we just had that discussion. How do we keep this community viable? How do we keep it a community where families and people can be here and live here and be part of our community? The Adams Street and City Hall properties, we issued RFPs and proposals have come in for those, and the council and the community are going to have decisions to make. We have two sizable developments that are under discussion that will have an impact on the city. The water and the wastewater rates, and addressing growth in tourism. Those are big issues for a small community to be facing in the next 6 to 9 months. All of those decisions are going to have a financial impact on the city of St. Helena. Again, we do not have the necessary staffing or resources at this point with this budget. In the way that the services are expected and being delivered, we have inadequate revenue to adequately run this community. Are there communities out there that have smaller general fund budgets? Yes, they are, but they also provide less services. And so that's been one of the challenges here, is a high demand for services, recreation programs, the library, the parks, the park maintenance. Those are high demand services. They're all people driven, and so the communities wanted those. We've funded those, but at this point, we're looking at revenue shortfalls that some of those services potentially could come into jeopardy. So, yes, there's smaller cities. Yes, there's smaller general fund budgets. There's choices that have been made over the years in various communities, and the choices that we've made to have a $10 million general fund revenue, but to have the level of services that have been requested in this community, we are now meeting a point where we're at a crossroads, and we're not balancing anymore. I talk a little bit about the improved management. I believe that we've done a better job, and I think that the process to get us here has been very open, very participative. I'm very proud of the team as we've talked about these things at various opportunities throughout the last 2 years. And so I'm hopeful that we've come to this together, and we've gotten to this point informed and educated together. The general fund reserve, I talk a little bit about that. We talked about that at the goal setting this last January. The council absolutely has the authority to set whatever goal you would like to have, set a policy for your general fund reserve, but it needs to be very thoughtful. We are a community with risks, and the higher your risks, the higher your general fund reserve would be. And we do have a very deteriorated infrastructure. In fact, just during the meeting, I got an email from our Public Works Director that says we have a water main break on Pratt. And we have to fix that. And we have a deteriorating infrastructure that you don't even see under the ground. And we have a wastewater fund that has zero reserves. And so if something happens in the wastewater system, it's the general fund who backfills that until there's adequate revenues to be able to cover repairs necessary in the wastewater system. And so that's a perfect example tonight of that's an unexpected expense that we're going to now have to cover. And so when you look at your general fund reserve targets, you need to take into consideration that we are at risk of floods, we are at risk of fires, we're at risk of an infrastructure failure, we're at risk of City Hall, quite frankly, being condemned. Those are potential catastrophic financial events that we have to have adequate revenues available in the general fund reserve or reserves available to be able to cover the costs of those kinds of things. And as I've said many times, some sort of catastrophe, a massive sinkhole, a fire, a flood, costs the same in St. Helena as it does in Oakland. Oakland has tens of millions, hundreds of millions. Santa Rosa has a $150 million general fund budget, and they have over $20 million in their general fund reserve. They can manage a major sinkhole or a major event. Costs the same in Santa Rosa as it does in St. Helena. We have $2.2 million or $2.3 million in our general fund reserve. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to be thoughtful about. Again, the lack of funds, replacement funds that have not been set aside. Our Public Works Director has made 2 presentations on the pavement management program, and we all know the conditions of the roads in St. Helena. And despite Measure T coming online in 2019, we're not going to get our roads up to a level that we have been requested to get them at, which is a very nice condition, and what we all strive for in local government is an 80. We're at a 55. And, you know, I always joke that's an F. To me, a 55 is an F. Out of 100, our roads are failing, and we've been listed in the local paper in the Bay Area for having the worst roads in the entire Bay Area. We have to maintain those roads, and we have to do a better job. We've put all of that, we've deferred all of that maintenance, and even with Measure T coming on board and some small gas tax money still coming in, our roads will remain at risk, even with that additional $665,000 being put into road maintenance. Our rating will not get above an at-risk rating. We also do not have money to maintain other city assets such as our downtown sidewalks. I've talked to Steve again and again. The best that we can do is have the maintenance crews go out and try to dig up some of those pavers that are slightly out of kilter and try to get them back down. To actually redo the Main Street sidewalks is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we do not have the money to do that. And we have people coming from all over the world to come see St. Helena, and you know, our sidewalks are in desperate need of maintenance, and we don't have the funds to do that. Our trees, we need to maintain our trees. We have to maintain our parks, our equipment, our ball fields, our buildings. Those are all obligations that we have and that we're currently not able to maintain. When we talk about community services, again, this community enjoys a very high level of services. It enjoys a terrific library. We did have to cut some hours out of it, but it's a fantastic library. It's a regionally serving, locally funded library. It was running around $1 million. We did make some cuts, and there were about $850,000 a year to run that library. Our recreation program runs about $650,000 a year to provide fantastic programs to our community. Those are things that have been important, but potentially become unaffordable. Again, when we talk about sort of the future of the city, one additional revenue source is not going to solve our problems. We've already absorbed the additional TOT coming from Las Alcabas. We've absorbed that in the increase in expenses that we expect over the next 10 years. Las Alcabas keeps us afloat. It keeps us from going into the red. It's not extra money available that we get to spend on things that we want to do on this list of things that I'm talking about. That money's not available for that. It's literally keeping us afloat and providing no monies to do any of the things that I've just talked about that we've neglected. So the culmination of all of this is what we're able to share with you is that if Measure D does not pass on the November ballot, my recommendation is that I come before the City Council in January 2017 and we begin looking at some fairly significant budget cuts. And those have to come from discretionary services. And those would need to come from park maintenance. They would need to come from the library and recreation. Those are the only areas basically that are at your discretion. All the other areas generally are required by some sort of law or compliance, whether that's in accounting, whether that's public records and records management, whether that's stormwater, whether that's the water and the wastewater facilities, whether that's the legal. There's just things that we have to do to operate the city. And so those would be the things that we would come forward and begin discussions about having to cut back on those services. And so that's basically the culmination of the report, is to say that I hope that you understand and that my recommendation would be that if Measure D does not pass, that would be an item that I would bring before you. And after all of that, and a list of the most attachments I've ever put to a staff report, A through O, I'm happy to try to answer your questions.
Well, let me begin by just making a brief comment, and that is the attachments A through O demonstrate that the council is well informed and that the information that you're presenting in one report has been brought to us many times in past reports, although sometimes at different times. I would go back to your budget transmittal letter of June 14th, 2016. If additional general fund revenues are not secured, service reductions will be required fiscal year 27-2018. So what you're presenting, at least to me, sadly, is not new news. It's out there, apparent, it's for all to see, and it's obviously motivated the City Council to put Measure D on the ballot. And again, as you stress, Measure D is by no means a complete answer. It helps keep us afloat, but our revenue needs are far greater than the revenue that would be brought in by Measure D. And thank you for putting all this information together in a report. It's obviously time-consuming to do, but it's also, I hope, proves to be very educational for the community, which perhaps hasn't been following all these issues with the care and diligence of the City Council and City Management.
An amazingly thoughtful and detailed synopsis of the past and in the current.
Is there any further comment? It is what it is.
Public comment?
Public comment? No. Yes,
All right, Jeff.
Mr. Stewart.
That siren means dollar signs, right? Yeah. Well, honor to the city management and city staff for all the hard work, and to the council too for taking everything so seriously. I think we're all learning too late, and maybe not too late, but we're all learning very late about the financial condition of the city. I want to speak on Measure D. When the Revenue Task Force was working, and I was on that task force, we heard the story of the Hayward sales tax increase. And part of their effort, which resulted in the measure passing, was to do a very comprehensive public relations effort. Now, obviously, those things cost money, and I don't think we have a budget to bring in a consultant to help us do that. But the election is only 55 days away, and I just put my signs up yesterday, yes, on Measure D. I've seen a few others, but I think the council, the city staff, and most of all the citizens need to get the message out there, and we need to use the urgency that I heard in Jennifer's voice just now. I don't think the populace, as honorable as they are, understand as a whole the dire straits that we're in. And I think there's still a significant number of people that think that the city leadership is putting a tax on the people to cover up their mistakes. They don't even really understand, all of them, that this is a new team managing the city. This is a new council. This is new leadership overall that is doing its best, working overtime, being very thoughtful, being very resourceful, imaginative, and committed. And somehow we've got to get the message out there that there's no choice here. This has to be done, and it's only the first step. So get ready for more things you may not like on the face of it. And we have to make the argument. I don't think we've really made the argument to the city. And as also as vice chair of the Friends and Foundation of the Library, I want to see our library survive. And I know that we have members of our organization, library staff members, library volunteers who would be happy to walk precincts, to do any of the typical election season work that you have to do to get a measure like this passed, especially where we're in a place where there are often knee-jerk anti-tax people who will reject any thought of a tax, no matter what the purpose, no matter how dire the circumstances. So I'd like to perhaps, I don't know what the means is. I'm thinking on my feet right now, but I think we need to engage the citizenry in this campaign more than we have up to this point. There are only 55 days left, and maybe instead of worrying about Hillary's health, we could be working on this. So just a statement on behalf of the city as a whole and on behalf of all of us as citizens, and to honor the work that all of you have been done. I think we need to give our best effort to making sure this measure passes. Thank you. I forgot to introduce myself. Jack Stewart, 22 Crane Avenue, St. Helena. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Any other public comment at this point? Okay, I'll close the public comment. Any further council discussion?
I just would like to follow along with what Jack was saying. I do sense that there is a trust issue still in the community and a transparency issue. No matter what we say, we really have to work hard to overcome that, and I've been grappling with various ideas of how to do that. One of the things I think the presentation was excellent. The information is very comprehensive, but I'm not sure if it's reaching the city. And what I had in mind a couple months ago when we were grappling with the sales tax issue was to do something like this, but have it in a town hall workshop kind of setting where the only issue was this item 20. And I think it is so serious and so important that we have to do that, even if it's on a Saturday and requires us to expend money for staff time. It is a critically important issue.
That's a good idea.
The need is there, but folks are still stuck on mismanagement and prior misuse or allegations of misuse funds. They don't see the need for the money, frankly. And I would like to see this information imparted in some kind of a formal town hall where we can invite folks and have a conversation and address questions. Now, that's more work for you, and you don't want to do this whole thing again, but I think it's required, frankly.
Maybe even 2.
The other thing is, the other thing I hear, I'm imparting information that's being funneled into me, and I hear it all the time, unfortunately, that we have not been transparent in how we intend to spend the money. That hurts me, because it's like, wow, we're working our butts off here, trying, the need's clearly there. You know where we're going to spend the money, but folks want to know. So we have a ballot question, and it lists basically 7 items to refresh your recollection. Local street maintenance, 911 emergency medical, fire and response, pedestrian, cycle, traffic safety, park maintenance, library services, programs for youth and seniors, and to preserve our financial stability. And I'm wondering, would it behoove us to put a percentage and attach it to each of those? We don't really know how much money we're going to get, but we're anticipating about $1.4 million a year. And would it give comfort to folks in the community to say, oh yeah, it's not just a list there, they actually intend to use the money for these purposes. Now, I know there are going to be conditions that would affect that. It wouldn't be binding, obviously. It would be binding politically, but I don't think legally. I would feel more comfortable if I can say, no, add this 1.4 million, first of all, the reserve would be my personal priority, but others have different priorities, and to attach numbers to it. I know we're sort of in the middle of budgets, and it's not the time to do it, but I think I want to be able to give some comfort to folks that the money is going to be spent appropriately. And I also think that at the end of the year, we have to account for how the money's spent. And I'd like to see some kind of an audit process. Hey, we anticipated 1.4 million. Maybe not the first year or the second year. Here's how it was spent. We go back to our ballot question and say, yes, it was spent just on these items. I think those are important things that we could do as a council to give comfort to our community. I would certainly feel more comfortable. And then the other thing that's sort of there, and I think you've touched upon it in many ways and over the last year, that this council has taken corrective action. We've done things internally with policies, with how we're governing this community, and we really need to lay it out clearly over and over again, because folks are saying, well, why should I trust you? You guys screwed up. No. Wait a minute. Okay, here's what we've done to make sure that does not happen again. I think that's important. That's an important message. If we're going to ask people to pay tax, we have to say we're going to manage it well. So those are the things that are steering in my mind. I don't know if the council agrees, but I think I would hate to have the trust issues sort of continue on. I take it very personally. I've been having conversations with a lot of different people, and I'm trying to get over that hurdle, but I see it's still there, and it's unfortunate. We have to work really hard at that.
I would almost take that a step further, which is not necessarily here's how we're going to spend it, but here's why we need it, and here's what it will be spent on. Because otherwise, we've got to cut these other things. So it can be high level because we don't know exactly where it's going to be spent, but order of magnitude. And I think you're right. Look, and then checking that after the end of the year, assuming it passes, which I hope that that's the case, then we'll be able to look back and have a measure of accountability that further creates transparency, but also rebuilds trust, right? There is mistrust that still exists here, and we can say all we want, but the only way we really rebuild it is through the action. And we've taken actions, but we need to continue to take actions that rebuild it. And I think what you've suggested is a great idea. If we have, I think we can put something together. Do we have the time? Do we have the resources? I think it's imperative that we make the time and allocate the resources to show how it's going to work, right? And then put in place that accountability such that we can look back and then continue to build that trust. Because I think there are going to be future measures. I think this is one. I think this is the first of many steps we need to take, and the first thing we need to do next year is once this passes, is come back with the list and get creative again and figure out where we're going to find more revenue for the things that we want to do above and beyond just staying afloat and delivering the basic services.
Well, I agree that it's incumbent on all of us to make the community aware of, and whether that means a booth at the farmer's market that we man that says, who has questions about Measure D, we'd be happy to answer it. Having small coffees, we'll be available at 9 o'clock at Dolce to answer any of your questions on every Wednesday between now and the election from 9 to 11. I don't know, but something like that in smaller groups is, I think, maybe it makes us more approachable to people. I do have a little bit of a concern about assigning percentages for, these are all the things that the money's going to go to, but if I'm just a little bit concerned that it may alienate some of the voters who say, well, I actually think they should spend more percentage on this, or they may have pet things that they would rather see a higher percentage. And if we start assigning percentages, I don't want to see us lose support by saying, I don't think that they should spend money on the library. This percentage. You know what I'm saying? I just feel like if we keep it at a higher level and really emphasize that without this measure passing, these are the ramifications.
I'm getting to the issue of transparency, and I would err on the side of transparency. I understand what
but
you're saying.
But I don't even know if we know what percentage we're going to...
We need to figure that out, I think. We're going to figure it out sometime during a budget hearing, right? I mean, we're going to have to allocate the money if we get it. Hopefully it'll pass. Yeah. And we're going to go, this is how we're spending it.
Well, yeah, but here's a good example. Like, $300,000 might go to fixing this water main break, right? And so we couldn't have allocated that. And if we didn't have that, then we'd be further depleting the general fund reserve, right? I think that's part of where these monies ultimately go, are for these unexpected deferred maintenance issues that otherwise would deplete our general reserves.
There are always
and put us
going
in
to be
a riskier,
exceptions to the
right?
rule, of course, and I acknowledge that. There's always going to be a potential risk out there where we can't use the money for that. We just got this huge flood or whatever it is. So, yeah, I understand that.
I think it's very difficult to allocate by percentage. As much as I admire the suggestion, there are just too many moving parts as I see it. I think the basic message has to be that if Measure D does not pass, just as the city manager said in the budget transmittal letter, we will have no choice but to make severe cuts that will impact our critical discretionary services that make us a community. That's really, to me, the core issue that needs to get out there, and I certainly accept and respect Mr. Stewart's suggestion that we need an extensive door-to-door campaign where those that enjoy the discretionary services can make their point to the community. That seems to me the fundamental way to go about it. I'm very concerned also that just talking about percentages and trying to work that out would chew into too much time with the short period between now and election. The mail ballots come out, I think, around October 9, and at least in our older community, people tend to vote pretty quickly. Sometimes after October 9, there just isn't much time. So that's really...
Well, I think it's a mistake not to, but I'm obviously not getting a lot of sympathy, but that's fine.
Well, can't we at least show, look, here's where our revenues are, here's where our expenses go to, here's, what unexpected things have cost over the last couple of years. If we don't have this much more, we're going to have to cut stuff. I mean, I think just some simple math that demonstrates that we actually need this, because I think some people are very suspicious and think this is just additional padding on the budget versus absolutely needed. And if we don't demonstrate that it's absolutely needed, then we're not doing our job towards getting it passed, because we haven't convinced people
If we
that
don't
we
get
need
this
it.
thing passed, then we're never going to get out of this hole that's been dug, that our entire infrastructure is falling apart. So, I mean, if we just could can what we heard tonight on item 20, I mean, and just repeat it over and over. And if there's some way of summarizing it so when we walk door to door that we could, say it in 5 minutes rather than half an hour.
How about the notion of a workshop?
Yeah, I mean,
I like the workshop.
I think if we
Folks
could,
can ask questions.
I think if we could get 500 people into a town hall meeting like we did on the general plan over at the elementary school,
Or even the short-term rental was a good.
yeah, and we have this same presentation. I mean, it's so obvious to me and to all of us because we've sat through the budget hearings and we've heard Steve's presentations and we've heard Jennifer's presentations that if we don't start doing this incrementally, and I agree, this is only one step to recovery. And I mean, if we don't, Charter Oak will never get fixed. Our streets are never going to get fixed. We're going to have broken water mains, coming at us left and right. And it's just going to compound over the years.
Well, and those items become priority over our amenity base, essentially.
Right.
Our extras,
Exactly.
which are rec,
And
parks, library, etc. So maybe we need one in September and one in October.
And I think it would be nice to have one evening session at the library. Everybody here enjoy this library, and just sort of just a casual, do you have questions about Measure D? Come and get some answers,
sure.
express your concerns, that kind of thing.
Sure, all of that sounds good, but again, I think we...
Timing.
Well, it's not just timing, but we need to be careful that we, at least on city facilities, if I'm understanding the rules properly, that we're educational and not advocates. Ms. Phillips was very clear in her presentation that she wasn't providing opinions one way or the other, that she was simply saying, hey, based upon choices the community made in the past, this is where we are today. And whereas we can be passionate advocates and we go door to door knocking on doors, but it's a different milieu in a city facility, as I understand the rules. Am I roughly right here?
Can I ask the members of the public what they think about town hall meeting, or
Well,
the few members here?
I'll open it up.
Jesse,
have a
what
thought?
do you think?
Ms. Stell or Mr. Joe? Okay, I think we should definitely try and schedule a couple. Yes, it's owned by the city. It's a city facility.
That's where if we could do it at the elementary school.
Oh, yeah,
It's a
on the
great
school
venue.
district property.
That's a
There's
great
really-
venue.
Is this working?
Yeah.
There's really nothing inappropriate with using a city facility for educational purposes.
Right.
And we've put together guidelines with the city manager and city staff for the differences between, under the case law, as to what constitutes advocacy on the one hand and what constitutes education on the other. And it's pretty clear, but city facilities can certainly be used, and city resources may be used to educate. And again, the tests are pretty clear for what is education versus advocacy. What happened this evening is a classic example of what the cases have addressed as education and not advocacy, which is setting forth what the facts are with respect to the city's financial condition and what the city's likely options will be in the event that the measure doesn't pass. So,
Can we use our banner across Main Street to present educational information?
banners are problematic, and the courts have, there's really one major court case that has addressed this. It was a case involving the city of Salinas several years ago. There have been a few other cases since then, but traditional advocacy in the election context usually includes things like banners, and so as if you use the banner, I don't know how you would use a banner to educate as opposed to saying yes on Measure D, which is a no-no.
You could simply say that the ramifications of not voting for Measure D are reduced services.
It would be, I would advise against using a banner for that, because banners are typically used in an advocacy setting in elections,
But
and
it
the courts
could
have
be-
recognized that.
So, but that could be, someone could rent the banner and fund it privately, right?
Private, the rules don't apply to private entities, and so, or to private individuals, and even city officials and employees are, they don't lose their First Amendment rights to support measures as long as they're doing it very clearly in their private time and their private capacities without using city funds or city resources.
Okay.
So what if we came up with a little flyer to hand out at the table at the farmer's market or places like that would just bullet point? You can't do that? Oh.
Well, we have the fact sheet.
Oh,
I mean,
oh,
we've
yeah,
got the
yeah,
city,
yeah.
we've got the
But-
fact sheet that
and
sets
that's
that all
okay
out.
to hand out at.
Yes, and indeed,
There's some back there at the table. So we
Right.
did. So, and we've been handing them out at the farmers
Oh.
market.
yes, and they've been available at City Hall.
Yes,
And
they're-
I've been emailing them to huge numbers of people.
So we're allowed to
as
use the
educational
same the same mechanisms for education that we do for other types of dissemination of information. So the e-news, flyers at the counter. So when we have an event at the library, when we have, let's say, a recycling event coming to town, anything that we want to inform our community about is a mechanism by which we have done education in the past, and we're allowed to use those same tools for educating about Measure D. And so utility bill stuffing we're allowed to do, and so my intention is as Jack mentioned, was to continue to produce flyers, attractive flyers, a different format, different information, but all just educational flyers.
Let me ask a question here. The council adopted an argument in favor that's going to be published with the ballot materials that everybody gets. There was no organized opposition file, as far as I recall.
That's correct.
But the argument in favor that was approved by the city council, it seems to me, sets out the basic reasons that we need the ballot measure. It summarizes it. It's fairly short. It could readily be talking points. I don't know whether that constitutes advocacy or whether that constitutes an educational material, but it may have to be rewritten slightly to be educational. I guess it's an advocacy piece because it's obviously arguing for Measure D. So I
Well,
think this
remember that you as individual council members have the right to advocate.
Right.
You may advocate. It's city employees and those of us sort of in the rank and file don't have that same right when we are acting in an official city capacity. So Ms. Phillips and her executive staff and all other city employees have the right when they're on their own time to advocate. And to say, boy, we're in support of Measure D, and you ought to be as well. That can't be done on city time where someone is getting paid with taxpayer funds or using City Hall or other city facilities for those advocacy purposes. Again, we've tried to assist. I put together some bullet points of do's and don'ts based on the case law. But again, those don't constrain you as council members when you're out in the community. You may advocate.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that the argument in favor adopted by the city council can, I think, be quickly put into bullet point pamphlet type form and contains the basic talking points that folks that canvass can and should use. It's very consistent with what they're going to read if they read the ballot materials that Mr. Tudor issues.
I just wanted to say that the library is having a candidates forum on September 29th. And so that's a chance to discuss the measure. And also we'll be having the League of Women Voters is also doing not a workshop, but they'll be talking about the pros and cons of measures, both throughout the state. I have October 20th here, so that's a chance for this to be brought up again. So.
And it would be okay for the candidates to advocate for Measure D at the city-owned library.
That's right. The candidates may do that. That's not using city resources in an improper way.
Okay, any further discussion? Okay, very good. Thank you so much.
Are we adjourned?
We're adjourned, yeah.